Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Have you ever felt a chill that seeps not just into your bones, but into your soul? I've lived in the Northview apartments for 3 years now, and Minnesota winters had never bothered me until this one. My unit on the 7th floor had always been my sanctuary from the brutal cold outside. A place where I, Daniel Winters, could escape the harsh realities of Minneapolis winters while still enjoying the snow-covered cityscape from my window. But something had changed this December. It started with the hallways. The normally well-heated corridors of our building suddenly felt like wind tunnels. At first, I dismissed it as a heating issue. Old buildings like ours often had temperamental systems. I even attended the tenant meeting where Mrs. Kowalski from the 8th floor complained loudly about the Arctic conditions in the East Wing. "It's not normal," she had insisted, her wrinkled hands clutching her cardigan tightly. "I've lived here for 22 years, and never has it been this cold." The building manager, Mr. Patel, had promised to look into it, but 2 weeks later, nothing had changed. If anything, it had gotten worse. Tonight, returning from my late shift at the hospital, I felt it immediately upon stepping out of the elevator. The hallway was freezing, my breath forming small clouds in front of my face. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered slightly, casting moving shadows on the faded wallpaper. Tap. 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 I paused, keys in hand. The sound came from down the corridor, like someone walking in heels on the tile floor. But it was 2 in the morning. Who would be wandering the halls? "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing slightly. No response. Just as I was about to dismiss it as my imagination, I felt something brush against my back, a whisper of cold that made me shiver involuntarily. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. Empty, but somehow not vacant. The air felt different, charged with something I couldn't name. The hairs on my arms stood on end, and not just from the cold. It was as if someone had walked over my grave, as my grandmother used to say. I hurried to my door, fumbling with the keys. Inside, I leaned against the closed door, relief washing over me. My apartment was warm, normal, safe, until I looked at my window. Frost patterns were spreading across the glass from the corners, delicate crystalline structures forming before my eyes. Beautiful, intricate patterns that resembled, was that a veil? A wedding veil? The pattern continued to grow, spreading across my window like living ice. I approached slowly, mesmerized despite my growing unease. As I reached out to touch the glass, the frost pattern shifted, and for a split second, I could have sworn I saw a face looking back at me, a woman's face, pale and sad. I jerked my hand back. The image was gone, leaving only the beautiful, terrifying frost patterns. That night, I slept with all the lights on. In the morning, I convinced myself it had been a trick of light, a tired mind playing tricks after a long shift. The window was clear, no trace of the frost patterns remained. But as I left for work, I noticed something in the hallway, something I missed in the dim light of night. A thin line of frost along the baseboards, melting slowly in the morning light. And on the wall, a single perfect handprint made of ice, too small to be a man's. By the time I returned that evening, the handprint was gone. But the feeling remained, the sense that something was watching, waiting in the cold hallways of the Northview apartments. Little did I know, this was only the beginning. The next few days passed in a blur of work and fitful sleep. I told myself the handprint had been a trick of the light, that the frost patterns were just a natural occurrence in an old building with poor insulation. But deep down, I knew better. The temperatures in the hallways continued to drop. Maintenance men came and went, checking thermostats and vents, but found nothing wrong with the heating system. Yet residents continued to complain. "It's like standing in a freezer," complained Mrs. Nguyen from apartment 712. "And have you noticed how the cold seems to follow you? Like a presence." I had noticed. The cold didn't dissipate naturally as it should. It moved, shifted, retreated, and advanced like a living thing. On Thursday evening, I was returning from the laundry room in the basement when I heard it again. Tap. 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 The sound of heels on tile coming from around the corner. This time, I decided to investigate. "Hello? Is someone there?" I called out, turning the corner. The hallway was empty, but the cold was intense, much worse than before. My breath formed thick clouds in front of my face, and my fingers began to ache within seconds. But what made me freeze in place wasn't the temperature, it was the walls. A thin layer of ice covered the hallway, spreading outward from a central point like a frozen splash. The wallpaper beneath was visible but distorted, colors muted by the crystalline layer. And there, in the center of the ice pattern, was a perfect impression of a hand, as if someone had pressed their palm against the wall while it was freezing. I approached slowly, my heart thundering in my chest. The rational part of my brain searched for explanations, a burst pipe behind the wall, perhaps. But no water leak could explain the perfect handprint or the way the ice seemed to radiate outward from it. As I reached out to touch it, the temperature dropped further. My fingers trembled inches from the ice. That's when I felt it, a presence behind me, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I turned slowly, every instinct screaming at me to run. The hallway appeared empty, but the air at the far end seemed to shimmer, like heat waves rising from hot pavement, except this was cold, so cold it distorted the light. And within that shimmer, I caught a glimpse of white fabric. A dress? A veil? "Who's there?" My voice cracked, barely above a whisper. The shimmer intensified, and with it came a sound, soft at first, then growing louder. A woman's voice, singing a lullaby I didn't recognize, the words unclear but the melody hauntingly beautiful. My phone chimed in my pocket, breaking the spell. When I looked back up, the shimmer was gone. But the ice remained, and the handprint, and the lingering notes of a song I couldn't name. That night, I researched the history of the Northview apartments. The building had been constructed in the 1950s, originally as a hotel before being converted to apartments in the 80s. There were the usual stories of deaths over the years, an elderly man who died of a heart attack in 615, a suicide in 922. But one story caught my attention. In 1978, during one of the worst blizzards in Minnesota history, a young woman had been found frozen to death in a stairwell between the 6th and 7th floors. According to the article, she had been wearing a white dress, later identified as a wedding gown. Katrina Novak, 24 years old, had been supposed to marry her fiancé that day. When the blizzard hit, she'd been trapped in the hotel. The power had gone out, and somehow, she'd ended up in the stairwell, where temperatures had plummeted well below zero. They found her the next morning, the article said, her body transformed by the cold into an ice sculpture of tragic beauty. I closed my laptop, my hands shaking. The stairwell between the 6th and 7th floors. My floor. As if summoned by my thoughts, the temperature in my apartment suddenly dropped. My breath clouded in front of me, and the lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. On my window, frost began to form again, spreading from the corners in delicate, lace-like patterns. But this time, they took a clear shape, words written in ice. Help me. I'm so cold. I stared at the message, paralyzed with fear and fascination. As I watched, the words began to fade, melting away until only normal frost patterns remained. Sleep eluded me that night. I lay awake, listening to the sounds of the building, the normal creaks and groans, but also the new sounds, the soft tap 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 of phantom footsteps in the hallway outside my door, and the faint, distant melody of a song I couldn't quite make out. In the morning, I found a trail of frost leading from my door to the stairwell. And when I opened the stairwell door, I found the entire landing covered in a thin sheet of ice, as if someone had gently breathed winter onto every surface. In the center of the landing, preserved in the ice, was a single white rose. I didn't tell anyone about what I'd seen. Who would believe me? That a ghost was haunting our building, leaving frozen messages and flowers made of ice? I'd be labeled the crazy guy from 7-Eleven faster than you could say psychiatric evaluation. But I couldn't ignore it either. The cold in the hallways was getting worse, and more residents were complaining. Mr. Patel had called in specialized HVAC technicians who were just as baffled as the regular maintenance crew. It's like the cold is coming from nowhere, I overheard one of them saying. The vents are pumping out heat, but it's disappearing into thin air. I knew where it was going. Or rather, who was taking it. That night, I made a decision. If Katrina Novak was haunting our building, I needed to know why. Why now, after all these years? Why was she asking for help? I waited until midnight, when the building was quiet. Then, armed with nothing but my phone's flashlight and a thermal blanket I'd stolen from the hospital supply closet, I made my way to the stairwell between the 6th and 7th floors. The door handle was ice cold to the touch. When I pulled it open, the blast of frigid air that hit me was like stepping into a walk-in freezer. My breath immediately formed thick clouds, and my nose hairs froze with each inhale. The stairwell was transformed. Every surface was covered in a layer of ice, thicker than before. The walls, the stairs, the railings, all encased in a glittering, translucent shell that caught and refracted the light from my phone in dazzling patterns. And there, in the center of the landing, was a figure. She stood with her back to me, a woman in a white dress that pulled around her feet like frozen seafoam. Her dark hair was pulled up in an elaborate style, with what looked like small crystals or pearls woven through it. Even from behind, I could see the ice that clung to her form, casting her in a blue-white glow. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. Terror and awe held me rooted to the spot as surely as if my feet had frozen to the floor. Slowly, so slowly, she began to turn. Katrina? I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible even to my own ears. She paused, then continued to turn until I could see her profile. Her skin was pale, almost blue, and covered in a fine layer of frost that sparkled in the light. Her eyes, when they finally met mine, were the color of ice over deep water. "You know my name," she said, her voice like the whisper of snow falling on silent streets. "No one remembers my name anymore." I clutched the thermal blanket tighter, though I knew it would offer no protection against whatever this was. "I read about you. About what happened." Her lips curved in a sad smile, frost crackling at the corners of her mouth. "They got it wrong. You know, the papers. I wasn't trapped by the blizzard. She took a step toward me, and the temperature dropped further. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, my very core beginning to chill. I was trapped by him, she continued. By Thomas. My fiancé. My love. The last word was spat out like a curse. I don't understand, I said, my teeth beginning to chatter. He changed his mind, Katrina said, taking another step closer. Ice spread from where her feet touched the ground, crawling up the walls in intricate patterns. The night before our wedding, he said he couldn't go through with it. That he'd met someone else. Another step. She was close now, close enough that I could see the individual ice crystals on her eyelashes. I ran away. Came here. I just wanted to be alone, to think. But then he followed me. We argued. He pushed me. Just once. But I fell. Hit my head on the railing. My eyes darted to the railing, where a dark stain marred the otherwise perfect ice, like rust or very old blood. He panicked, she continued. Ran away. Left me here, bleeding, unconscious. And then the blizzard came. The power went out. The heat stopped. And I froze. Slowly. Painfully. She reached out a hand, her fingers inches from my face. The cold emanating from her was unbearable now, my skin burning with it. Do you know what it feels like? She whispered. To freeze to death? To feel your blood slow in your veins? To feel your heart struggle to beat as ice forms around it? I shook my head, unable to speak through my chattering teeth. I can show you, she said, her voice suddenly tender. I can make you understand. Just take my hand. Her fingers reached for mine, and in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that if she touched me, I would die. I would freeze solid where I stood, another victim of the bride's cold embrace. I stumbled backward, falling against the door. I can't, I gasped. I'm sorry, but I can't. Something flickered in her icy eyes, disappointment, anger, or perhaps something else entirely. She lowered her hand. Then why are you here? She asked, her voice hardening. Why did you come? You asked for help, I said, remembering the message on my window. You wrote help me on my window. She tilted her head, frost falling from her hair like dandruff. And you came. Brave. Foolish. What do you want? I asked, my voice steadier now that she had withdrawn slightly. What kind of help do you need? Her expression changed, the anger melting away to reveal something that looked almost like hope. I want peace, she said simply. I want to rest. But I can't. Not until he pays for what he did. Thomas? I asked. Your fiancé? She nodded, and the temperature dropped again. He lives here now. In this building. He came back after all these years. And he doesn't even know I'm here, watching him, following him. The revelation hit me like a bucket of ice water. Someone in our building was her murderer, living his life in ignorance while she haunted these halls. Who is he? I asked. What's his name now? But Katrina was already fading, her form becoming translucent, the ice around us beginning to melt. Find him, she whispered, her voice growing distant. Make him confess. Set me free. And then she was gone, leaving only a puddle of water on the landing and the lingering scent of winter roses. I fled back to my apartment, locking the door behind me as if that could keep out a ghost. My hands shook as I pulled out my laptop, determined to find out who among my neighbors might be the man who had killed Katrina Novak nearly 50 years ago. The next day, I called in sick to work. I couldn't focus, couldn't think about anything but Katrina and her killer. I spent hours online, searching archives, public records, anything that might give me a clue about Thomas, a last name, a description, anything. Finally, in a digital copy of the Minneapolis Star from 1978, I found it. A small article about Katrina's death, mentioning her fiancé, Thomas Bergman, 26 years old at the time. The article included a grainy photo of a young man with a square jaw and piercing eyes that seemed to look right through the camera. If he was still alive, he'd be in his 70s now. Was it possible he had moved back to the building where his fiancée had died? Why would anyone do that? Unless he didn't know she was here. Unless he thought his secret was safe. I cross-referenced the tenant directory with property records, searching for any mention of Thomas Bergman. Nothing. But that didn't mean anything. He could have changed his name, married, divorced, any number of things in the intervening decades. As night fell, the temperature in my apartment dropped again. I could feel her presence now, hovering at the edges of my awareness. The frost patterns returned to my windows, more intricate than before. I need more information, I said aloud, feeling only slightly ridiculous talking to my empty apartment. A name, an apartment number, anything. The frost shifted, swirled, and then formed words. 821. He calls himself Theodore now. Apartment 821. 1 floor above me. I passed by it countless times, never giving it a second thought. The old man who lived there kept to himself, rarely leaving except to collect his mail or take short walks when the weather permitted. Theodore. The name was close enough to Thomas that it might just be a coincidence, but I doubted it. Katrina knew. Somehow, she had found him. I waited until nearly midnight, then made my way to the 8th floor. The hallway was freezing, ice crystals forming on the walls as I passed. She was with me, watching, waiting. Apartment 821 was at the end of the hallway. I stood outside the door, my heart pounding. What was I going to do? Knock and accuse an elderly man of murder? Call the police with a ghost's testimony? Before I could decide, the door opened. He was old now, his hair white and thin, his once strong frame stooped and frail. But the eyes were the same, piercing, alert, and suddenly wide with shock as he saw me standing there. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice quavering slightly. "I know who you are," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "I know what you did to Katrina." The color drained from his face. He looked past me, down the hallway, as if expecting to see someone else. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice betrayed him. "She told me everything," I continued, feeling emboldened by his reaction. "How you pushed her. How you left her to die." "She's dead," he whispered, but it sounded more like a question than a statement. "Not entirely," I replied. The temperature in the hallway plummeted suddenly, our breath forming thick clouds between us. The old man, Theodore, Thomas, whatever he called himself now, began to tremble, but not just from fear. "You feel it, don't you?" I asked. "The cold. It's been her all along. She's been watching you, waiting for you to recognize what you did." He shook his head, backing into his apartment. "It was an accident," he said, his voice breaking. I never meant to hurt her. I loved her. You left her to die, I said, following him inside, driven by a strange combination of pity and righteous anger. You could have called for help. You could have saved her. I was scared, he cried, collapsing into an armchair. I was young and stupid and scared. By the time I came back, it was too late. She was already gone. The lights in the apartment flickered, and the windows began to frost over. I could feel her rage building, the air growing colder by the second. She wants you to confess, I said, my teeth chattering. She wants peace. Theodore looked up, his eyes suddenly focusing on something behind me. His face contorted in a mixture of terror and wonder. Katrina, he whispered. I turned slowly. She stood in the doorway, more solid than I had ever seen her. Her wedding dress was stained with frost and old blood, her skin blue-white with cold. But her eyes burned with an intensity that seemed to pierce through the decades of pain and loneliness. Tell them, she said, her voice like ice cracking on a frozen lake. Tell them what you did. Theodore began to weep, his tears freezing on his cheeks. I pushed her, he admitted, his voice breaking. We were arguing about the wedding. I wanted to call it off. She was upset. She threatened to tell everyone why, that I'd been embezzling from my company, that I was about to be caught. I panicked. I pushed her. She fell down the stairs, hit her head. He looked up at Katrina, his eyes pleading. I thought you were dead already. I swear, I thought you were gone. I never meant for you to freeze to death. I never wanted that. But you left me, Katrina said, moving closer, ice forming where her feet touched the carpet. You left me to die alone. I'm sorry, Theodore sobbed. God help me, I've been sorry every day for 47 years. I stood frozen in place, a witness to this impossible confrontation between the living and the dead. The room was so cold now that my eyelashes were frosting over, my fingers numb and painful. Katrina moved closer to Theodore, reaching out a hand toward his face. I forgive you, she said, her voice softening. Now it's time for you to face what you've done. Theodore nodded slowly, tears still streaming down his face. I'll call the police, he said. I'll tell them everything. I promise. Katrina turned to me, a small smile on her frost-covered lips. Thank you, she said. For listening. For believing. Then she was gone, the temperature in the room slowly returning to normal. Theodore sat in his chair, looking smaller and older than before, but somehow at peace. I'll stay with you, I told him, reaching for his phone. While you make the call. As Theodore dialed with trembling fingers, I looked out the window. The frost patterns were fading, melting away like winter giving way to spring. But in the center of the glass, one perfect handprint remained, a final testament to the bride who had walked the frozen hallways for nearly 5 decades, seeking nothing but the truth. The police came that night. 2 officers, looking confused and skeptical as Theodore confessed to a crime committed almost half a century ago. They took him away for questioning, treating him with the careful respect reserved for the elderly, even when that elderly person has just admitted to manslaughter. I gave my statement, a carefully edited version that left out any mention of ghostly encounters or messages written in frost. I told them I'd been researching the building's history for a blog project and had discovered newspaper articles about Katrina's death that made me suspicious. That I confronted Theodore and he had broken down, confessing everything. The truth, but not the whole truth. In the days that followed, the hallways of Northview Apartments slowly warmed. The maintenance crew was baffled but relieved, assuming their tinkering with the heating system had finally fixed the problem. Residents emerged from their apartments without layers of sweaters, no longer seeing their breath cloud in front of them. The story made the local news. Cold case solved after 47 years. Elderly man confesses to fiance's death. Theodore Bergman, formerly Thomas Bergman, was charged but released on bail due to his age and health. His trial date was set for spring. I found myself unable to sleep in my apartment. Every creak, every slight change in temperature had me looking over my shoulder, expecting to see Katrina standing there in her frost-covered wedding dress. But she never appeared. 2 weeks after Theodore's confession, I decided to visit the stairwell between the 6th and 7th floors one last time. It was warm now, just like the rest of the building. No ice, no frost, no lingering chill. Just ordinary concrete steps and metal railings, showing their age but nothing more. I stood on the landing where she had died, trying to feel something, her presence, her absence, anything. But there was nothing. Just the ordinary sounds of an old building settling into itself. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye, a small white object in the corner of the landing. I bent down to examine it. A single white rose, fresh and perfect, its petals slightly damp as if it had just begun to thaw. I left it there, a memorial to a bride who had waited nearly 50 years for justice, for peace. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in weeks. No frost patterns formed on my windows. No phantom footsteps echoed in the hallway. The cold had finally lifted from Northview Apartments. In my dreams, I saw Katrina one last time, not as the frozen bride with ice in her hair and frost on her skin, but as she must have been in life, warm, vital, her dark eyes bright with possibilities. She smiled at me, a real smile that reached those eyes, and then turned away, walking toward a light I couldn't see. When spring came, Theodore pleaded guilty to manslaughter and was sentenced to 5 years, suspended due to his age and health. He would never serve time in prison, but his confession had been enough. The truth, hidden for so long, had finally thawed. I stayed in the building, though many residents moved out after the story broke. Who wants to live in a place where such a tragedy occurred? But I couldn't leave. Something held me there, not Katrina's ghost, but perhaps her memory. Sometimes, on the coldest winter nights, when the wind howls against the building and frost forms natural patterns on the windows, I think I hear the faint sound of heels tapping on tile or catch a glimpse of white fabric disappearing around a corner. But it's just my imagination, I tell myself. Just memories of a long, strange winter when the hallways froze and a bride walked once more among the living. Yet every year, on the anniversary of her death, I leave a single white rose on the landing between the 6th and 7th floors. And sometimes, when I return the next day, the rose is gone, not wilted or swept away, but simply vanished, as if someone had picked it up and carried it away. I like to think it's her way of saying thank you, of letting me know that wherever she is now, it's warmer than the frozen hallways where she wandered for so long. And on those days, I don't mind the slight chill in the air or the faint scent of winter roses that lingers around me like a gentle embrace. After all, not all cold is to be feared. Sometimes, it's just a reminder of what once was, and what finally found peace in the thaw. What do you do when the walls start to speak? When I first started working at Bellamy's, the oldest fine dining establishment in downtown Atlanta, I never expected to become obsessed with a steel cabinet. My name is Marcus Reynolds, and I've been the assistant manager at Bellamy's for just over 3 months. The restaurant occupies a historic building from the 1920s, complete with Art Deco flourishes and an elegance that modern establishments struggle to replicate. The first time I noticed something odd was during inventory. The restaurant was empty, the lunch rush long over an hour before dinner service would begin. I was alone in the back storage room, counting wine bottles and checking them against our inventory list. The storage room itself was unremarkable: concrete floors, exposed brick walls, and metal shelving filled with supplies. But there was something else in the corner, partially hidden behind stacks of folded tablecloths and napkins. A tall steel cabinet. It looked out of place among the more modern storage options. Heavy and imposing, with a tarnished exterior that suggested decades of use. A massive padlock secured its double doors. When I asked Thomas, the owner, about it, he simply shrugged. "Been there since I bought the place 15 years ago," he said. Previous owner said it was bolted to the floor and too much trouble to remove. Lock's been rusted shut for years. Yet something about the cabinet nagged at me. Maybe it was how out of place it seemed, or perhaps it was the way it seemed to absorb the light around it. Whatever the reason, I found myself glancing at it whenever I entered the storage room. One evening, after closing, I was alone again in the storage room. The building had settled into that peculiar quietude that old structures adopt when empty, a silence that feels pregnant with whispers. As I was organizing some supplies, I heard a distinct metallic click. I turned toward the sound. The cabinet doors trembled slightly, as if something inside had shifted. I froze, my breath caught in my chest. Then came another sound, a low, resonant thud from within the cabinet. My rational mind immediately searched for explanations: the building settling, pipes expanding or contracting, maybe even a small animal that had somehow found its way inside. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the sound was deliberate. I approached the cabinet slowly, my footsteps echoing in the otherwise silent room. Up close, I could see intricate patterns in the metalwork that I hadn't noticed before, Art Deco designs that matched the restaurant's facade. The padlock was enormous and ancient, its keyhole filled with rust. Just as I reached out to touch the cabinet's surface, the overhead lights flickered. Not in the gentle, barely noticeable way that fluorescent lights sometimes do, but dramatically, plunging the room into complete darkness for 3 heartbeats before returning. In that brief moment of darkness, I could have sworn I heard breathing from inside the cabinet. The next day, I couldn't focus on my work. Every free moment, my mind returned to the cabinet. During lunch service, I found myself staring through the open door to the storage area, half expecting to see the cabinet doors swinging open of their own accord. "You okay?" Jessica, one of our veteran servers, asked. "You've been distracted all day." I explained about the cabinet, trying to make light of my interest, but even to my own ears, I sounded obsessed. "Oh, that old thing," Jessica said, her expression shifting subtly. "There are stories about it, you know." "What kind of stories?" She glanced around, as if checking whether anyone was listening. Back in the 30s and 40s, this place wasn't just a restaurant. The basement level was a speakeasy during Prohibition, and afterward, well, let's just say there were gambling operations. Rumor has it the original owner had connections. Connections? You mean like mob connections? Jessica nodded. The cabinet supposedly belonged to him. Staff aren't supposed to talk about it, bad for business, you know? But there have always been rumors about what's inside. And no one's ever opened it? Not that I know of, she said. Or if they did, they didn't stick around to tell the tale. I laughed at her obvious attempt to frighten me, but the laugh sounded hollow even to my own ears. That night, after everyone had left, I returned to the storage room with a bolt cutter I purchased on my way to work. I stood before the cabinet, the weight of the tool heavy in my hands, listening to the strange silence of the empty restaurant. What was I doing? Breaking into restaurant property could cost me my job. And yet, I couldn't explain the compulsion I felt. It was as if the cabinet itself wanted to be opened. As I positioned the bolt cutter around the shackle of the padlock, a sudden draft whispered through the room, cold enough to raise goosebumps on my arms. The overhead light flickered again, and in the momentary darkness, I heard something move inside the cabinet. A scraping sound, like fingernails against metal. My hands trembled as I squeezed the handles of the bolt cutter. The padlock was thick, but the rust had weakened it. With one final effort, the shackle snapped. The lock fell to the floor with a thunderous clang. For a long moment, I stood frozen, half expecting alarms to sound or for Thomas to rush in, demanding to know what I was doing. But the restaurant remained silent. I reached for the cabinet doors, my fingertips brushing against the cold metal. As I pulled, the hinges protested with a low, mournful creak that seemed to reverberate through the entire building. The doors swung open, revealing the cabinet's dark interior. The smell hit me first, musty and metallic, like old pennies in decay. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness inside, I could make out several items hanging on hooks. Suits. 3 vintage men's suits, the fabric faded and worn. They hung limply, like abandoned skin. And on each one, dark stains that could only be blood. My heart hammered against my ribs as I reached out to touch one of the suits. The fabric felt brittle under my fingers, as if it might disintegrate at any moment. The bloodstains were old, so old that they had turned a rusty brown, almost black in the dim light. Behind the suits, something caught my eye. The back panel of the cabinet wasn't solid as I'd expected. There appeared to be seams in the metal, suggesting a door or a compartment. Just then, the cabinet shuddered. Not from my touch, this movement came from within. The suits swayed slightly, as if someone had brushed past them. The metal walls of the cabinet groaned, a low sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on something. As I regained my balance, I realized the cabinet doors were slowly closing on their own. I lunged forward, wedging my body between them to keep them open. That's when I felt it, a cold breath on the back of my neck, carrying with it the whisper of a voice. You shouldn't have opened it. I whirled around, but the storage room was empty. Yet the feeling of being watched intensified, pressing down on me like a physical weight. The cabinet doors pushed against me, trying to close, to trap me. With one desperate shove, I forced the doors fully open again and stepped back. The suits continued to sway gently, as if disturbed by some unfelt breeze. The bloodstains seemed darker now, more pronounced. And somewhere in the depths of the restaurant, I heard the distinct sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that didn't belong to anyone who should be in the building. Every time I close my eyes, I see those suits hanging in the cabinet. It's been 3 days since I discovered them, and I haven't told anyone what I found. Not even Jessica, who keeps giving me concerned looks during service when she thinks I'm not paying attention. You look like you haven't slept, she commented this morning as we prepared for the brunch crowd. Is everything okay? I mumbled something about insomnia and changed the subject. How could I possibly explain what was happening? That I'd found blood-stained suits in a locked cabinet? That I now heard whispers every time I entered the storage room? That the cabinet itself seemed to breathe? After my discovery, I had carefully closed the cabinet doors and replaced the broken padlock with one that looked similar enough that a casual observer wouldn't notice the difference. I kept the key in my pocket, its weight a constant reminder of what I'd found. During quiet moments, I researched Bellamy's history. The restaurant had indeed started as a speakeasy during Prohibition, owned by a man named Vincent Romano. Records about him were sparse, but I found a newspaper article from 1943 mentioning his unexpected disappearance and the subsequent takeover of the establishment by his nephew. The article hinted at possible connections to organized crime but offered no concrete details. 3 men had vanished around the same time, business associates of Romano. The police investigated but never found any bodies. 3 missing men. 3 suits in the cabinet. The connection seemed obvious, yet so fantastical that I questioned my own logic. What was I suggesting? That someone had murdered these men decades ago and stored their bloody clothes in a cabinet? That somehow their spirits remained trapped inside? It sounded absurd. And yet, today, I decided to examine the cabinet again. The restaurant had closed early for a private event that had canceled at the last minute, giving me a rare opportunity to investigate without fear of interruption. The storage room felt different now, colder, more oppressive. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper, more substantial. As I approached the cabinet, the overhead light flickered, as if in warning. My hands trembled as I unlocked the padlock. The click of the mechanism releasing echoed in the silent room. I hesitated before opening the doors, half expecting, half hoping that the suits would be gone, that I had imagined the whole thing. But they were still there, hanging just as I had found them. In the harsh glare of my flashlight, the bloodstains looked even more pronounced, mapping patterns of violence across the fabric. I focused on the back panel of the cabinet, where I noticed seams that suggested another compartment. Pressing my flashlight between my teeth, I ran my fingers along the edges of the metal, searching for a mechanism, a latch, anything that might reveal what lay behind. The metal felt unnaturally cold beneath my fingertips, as if it were drawing heat from my body. Then I felt it, a small depression in the metal, barely noticeable unless you were specifically looking for it. I pressed, and with a soft click, the back panel shifted slightly. A wave of stale air rushed out, carrying with it a smell that made my stomach turn, the unmistakable odor of decay, somehow preserved all these years. I covered my nose and mouth with my sleeve and shined the flashlight into the newly revealed space. It wasn't just a compartment, it was a passageway. Narrow and dark, it appeared to lead downward, beneath the restaurant. Old wooden stairs descended into darkness. My rational mind screamed at me to close the panel, lock the cabinet, and walk away. Perhaps even quit my job and never return to Bellamy's. But something stronger pulled at me, a need to know, to understand what I had uncovered. As I stood there, debating my next move, the suits behind me rustled. Not the gentle sway I had noticed before, but a deliberate movement. I spun around, the flashlight beam dancing across the fabric. For a split second, so briefly that I could almost convince myself I had imagined it, I saw the middle suit fill out, as if an invisible body had stepped into it. Then it collapsed back into emptiness. A whisper drifted from the fabric, "Follow us down." My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I backed away from the cabinet, intending to flee, when the doors suddenly slammed shut with a force that shook the entire frame. The sound echoed through the storage room like a gunshot. I stood frozen, terror paralyzing me. Then, slowly, the doors began to open again, revealing not the suits I expected but the dark passageway, now fully exposed. The suits had vanished. From below came sounds, voices engaged in muffled conversation, the clink of glasses, faint music playing on a gramophone. Sounds from another time. Against every instinct for self-preservation, I found myself stepping forward, drawn by curiosity and something else I couldn't name. As I approached the threshold of the passageway, the overhead light in the storage room died completely, leaving only my flashlight to illuminate the way. The first step creaked beneath my weight. The second groaned. By the third, I was fully committed to my descent. The air grew colder with each step, and the sounds from below grew clearer, men's voices, laughing and arguing. The music became recognizable, a jazz standard from the 40s. At the bottom of the stairs, a short corridor led to what appeared to be a door. Light seeped from beneath it, not the harsh fluorescence of modern bulbs, but the warm glow of incandescent lighting. The voices came from beyond. I pressed my ear against the wood. The conversation was clearer now. "We can't just make them disappear, Vinny." A nervous voice, high-pitched with anxiety. "We ain't discussing this further." A deeper voice, authoritative. "They seen too much. It's them or us." But 3 men, people will notice. There'll be questions. Questions don't mean answers. They'll be looking in the river, not in our backyard. My blood ran cold. I was hearing a conversation from the past, a conversation about murder. The door beneath my hand suddenly felt warm, almost hot. I jerked back just as it began to open of its own accord. Light spilled into the corridor, momentarily blinding me. I raised my arm to shield my eyes, and when I lowered it, I found myself looking into a fully furnished speakeasy from another era. Round tables covered with green felt. A polished bar stocked with bottles. A small stage where a gramophone played. And seated at one of the tables, 3 men in suits identical to those I had found in the cabinet. They didn't seem to notice me standing in the doorway. They continued their conversation, their faces animated in the warm light. One man, Vinny, I presumed, was speaking firmly to the others, his hands moving emphatically. He was a large man with a square face and cold eyes. The other 2 looked nervous, glancing repeatedly at the door behind them. I stood transfixed, watching this scene from the past play out before me. Then, suddenly, all 3 men turned to look directly at me. Their eyes, previously full of life and emotion, became flat and empty. Their faces transformed, flesh seeming to melt away, revealing glimpses of skull beneath. "You opened the door," then he said, his voice no longer coming from the figure at the table but seeming to emanate from all around me. "Now you're part of this." The room began to shimmer and distort, the edges blurring. The gramophone's music slowed and deepened, becoming a grotesque parody of the original tune. The lights flickered, and in the momentary darkness, the men disappeared from the table. When the lights steadied again, they were standing directly in front of me, their faces fully transformed into grotesque masks of decay. Behind them, I could now see 3 bodies slumped in the corner of the room, fresh blood pooling around them. "We need somewhere to put them," Vinny said, his voice echoing strangely. "Somewhere they won't be found." "The cabinet," one of the others suggested. "We can hide them behind the cabinet." "No," Vinny shook his head. "In the walls of the cabinet itself. We'll seal it up. No one will think to look there." As they spoke, the room began to fade, growing dimmer and less substantial. The men's forms became transparent, and through them I could see the corridor as it currently was, empty and dusty, long abandoned. I backed away, my heel catching on the bottom step of the stairs. I stumbled, nearly falling. When I looked up again, the speakeasy was gone entirely. Only the empty corridor remained, illuminated by my flashlight. A cold draft wafted up from below, carrying with it a whisper, "They're still here. We're all still here." I turned and scrambled up the stairs, my only thought to escape this place. Behind me, I heard the sound of footsteps following, not the echo of my own, but a deliberate, unhurried pace. At the top of the stairs, I burst through the cabinet's back panel into the storage room. The overhead light was working again, casting harsh shadows across the floor. I spun around to close the panel, to seal away whatever was coming up those stairs. But the panel was already closed. The suits hung innocently in the cabinet once more, showing no sign of the passage I had just fled through. I slammed the cabinet door shut and locked the padlock with trembling hands. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those men staring at me, their faces decaying before my eyes. I heard Vinny's voice, "Now you're part of this." What did that mean? What had I become part of by opening that cabinet? I called in sick the next day, unable to face returning to Bellamy's. I spent the morning researching, digging deeper into the restaurant's history and the men who had disappeared. Old newspaper archives yielded more information than I initially found. The three missing men were Anthony Marconi, Peter Doyle, and Richard Klein, business partners in a shipping company that was rumored to be a front for smuggling operations. They were last seen entering Bellamy's, then called Romano's, on March 12, 1943. Their disappearance caused a brief sensation in the local press, but the investigation quickly went cold. Vincent Romano himself vanished 2 weeks later. The official story was that he had fled to avoid questioning about the missing men, but no trace of him was ever found. My apartment felt too small, the walls too close. Every creak of the building made me jump. By evening, I had convinced myself that what I had experienced was some kind of hallucination brought on by stress and an overactive imagination. I needed to go back to prove to myself that there was a rational explanation. The restaurant would be busy with the dinner service, which meant the storage room would likely be undisturbed. I could slip in, take another look at the cabinet in the safety of a building full of people, and put this madness behind me. I arrived just after 7, when Bellamy's would be at its busiest. The hostess, Miranda, gave me a surprised look. Feeling better, she asked as I walked past the front desk. "Much," I lied. "Just forgot something in my office yesterday. Won't be long." The main dining room was indeed packed, the hum of conversation and the clink of silverware creating a comforting blanket of normality. I nodded to a few servers as I made my way toward the back, trying to appear casual. The hallway leading to the storage room was empty. I hesitated outside the door, my hand on the knob. Part of me wanted to turn around, to walk out of Bellamy's and never return. But I needed answers. I needed to know if what I had experienced was real. I pushed open the door. The storage room appeared exactly as it always had. Shelves lined with supplies, cases of wine stacked neatly against one wall. And in the corner, the steel cabinet, its tarnished surface reflecting the overhead light in dull patches. I approached it slowly, my footsteps sounding unnaturally loud. The cabinet stood silent and still, no movement, no sounds emanating from within. I reached into my pocket for the key to the padlock, then froze. There was no padlock. The cabinet doors were secured with a heavy chain and a different lock entirely, one I didn't have the key to. I stared in confusion. Had someone discovered that I'd replaced the original lock? But who would have had a chain ready? And why not confront me about it? As I stood there, trying to make sense of this development, the overhead light began to flicker. Not in the dramatic way it had before, but a subtle, almost imperceptible flutter. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "Marcus?" Jessica's voice came from behind me, making me jump. "What are you doing back here? I thought you were sick." I turned to face her, struggling to compose myself. "Just needed to check something." "Who put this chain on the cabinet?" Jessica frowned, her gaze moving from me to the cabinet and back. "What chain?" I gestured impatiently at the cabinet. "This chain. With the padlock. It wasn't here before." Her frown deepened. She stepped closer, looking at the cabinet. "Marcus, there's no chain. Just the same old rusty padlock that's always been there." I felt a chill run down my spine. I looked back at the cabinet and saw that she was right. There was no chain, only the padlock I had placed there myself 3 days ago. "Are you okay?" Jessica asked, genuine concern in her voice. "You look like you've seen a ghost." The phrase was so ironically apt that I almost laughed. Instead, I rubbed my eyes. "Just tired. Haven't been sleeping well." Jessica studied me for a moment. "There's something you should know," she said finally, her voice lowered. I didn't want to say anything before because it seemed so. "I don't know, silly. But after seeing you like this..." "What is it?" She glanced at the door to make sure we were alone. "About 2 years ago, before you started here, we had another assistant manager. Ellie Martin. She became obsessed with that cabinet too. Started spending a lot of time back here alone. She'd come in early, stay late. Thomas eventually had to talk to her about it." My mouth went dry. "What happened to her?" "She quit suddenly. Left a note saying she couldn't work here anymore. No one's heard from her since." Jessica paused. "The weird thing is, right before she left, she told me she opened the cabinet and found something inside. Something terrible. But when Thomas checked, it was empty. Just an old, empty cabinet." I felt lightheaded. "Did she say what she found?" "Old clothes," she said. "Men's suits with bloodstains on them." Jessica shivered. "And she claimed there was a hidden door in the back that led to a staircase. Thomas thought she was having some kind of breakdown. The confirmation that someone else had seen what I had seen should have been reassuring. Instead, it filled me with dread. This wasn't my imagination. This was happening. Do you know where she is now?" "Ellie?" Jessica shook her head. "No one does. It was like she vanished. Like she vanished. Just like Vincent Romano and the 3 men whose suits hung in the cabinet." "Marcus, whatever's going on with you, maybe you should talk to someone," Jessica suggested gently. "This place, it has a history. Sometimes that history can get into your head." Before I could respond, we heard Thomas calling for Jessica from the dining room. She gave my arm a squeeze. "Think about what I said, okay? And maybe stay away from that cabinet." After she left, I stood staring at the padlock. Had I imagined the chain? Was I losing my grip on reality? Or was something in this restaurant, something connected to that cabinet, playing with my perception? I needed to know more about Ellie Martin. If she had experienced the same things I had, maybe she had discovered something that could explain what was happening. Finding her became my new obsession. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I retreated to my small office, searching online for any trace of Ellie Martin. There wasn't much: a LinkedIn profile that hadn't been updated in 2 years, a few social media accounts that had gone dormant around the same time. It was as if she had simply stepped out of her life. By closing time, the restaurant had emptied of customers. The staff were finishing their cleanup duties. I should have gone home, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. Not yet. Not without taking one more look at the cabinet. I waited until everyone was gone, until the building had settled into that eerie silence that seemed to amplify every small sound. Then I made my way back to the storage room. The cabinet waited for me in the corner, unchanged. This time, there was no flickering light, no sudden cold. Just an ordinary storage room with an ordinary cabinet. Except I knew better. I unlocked the padlock and pulled open the doors. The 3 suits hung inside, just as before. The bloodstains seemed to have spread, covering more of the fabric than I remembered. And was it my imagination, or did the suits hang differently now? They seemed to fill out slightly, as if invisible bodies were beginning to inhabit them. I forced myself to reach past them, to find the seam in the back panel that I knew was there. My fingers found the depression, and I pushed. There was a soft click, and the panel shifted, revealing the dark passageway and stairs beyond. But I didn't descend immediately. Instead, I studied the suits more carefully. Each was different, one a pinstripe charcoal gray, one navy blue, one brown. They were well made, expensive for their time, and each bore different patterns of bloodstains, telling different stories of violence. As I examined them, I noticed something I had missed before. In the inside pocket of the gray suit was a small bulge. Hesitantly, I reached in and pulled out a wallet. The leather was cracked and stiff with age, but it had preserved its contents. Inside was an identification card for Anthony Marconi, along with several black and white photographs. One showed Marconi with a woman and 2 small children. A family he had left behind. This was real. These men had been real people with real lives. And something terrible had happened to them in this building. I replaced the wallet and turned my attention to the passageway. The stairs disappeared into darkness, but this time I heard no voices from below, no music. Just a waiting silence. With my flashlight in hand, I began to descend. The steps creaked under my weight, and I could feel the age of the wood beneath my feet. The air grew colder with each step, carrying that same musty odor of decay. At the bottom, the corridor stretched before me, ending at the door I had seen before. But unlike my previous visit, no light seeped from beneath it, no voices came from beyond. It stood closed and silent. I approached cautiously, half expecting it to swing open on its own as it had before. When it didn't, I reached out and grasped the handle myself. It turned easily, and I pushed the door open. My flashlight revealed not the bustling speakeasy of my previous vision, but a dusty, abandoned room. Tables and chairs were still arranged as they had been, but decades of neglect had left them covered in thick layers of dust and cobwebs. The bar stood empty, its surface dulled by time. The gramophone sat silent on the small stage, its horn full of dust. I stepped inside, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air was heavy with age and abandonment. This place had been sealed away, forgotten for decades. Yet it was undeniably real, not a hallucination or a vision from the past. As I moved deeper into the room, my light caught something in the corner, the same corner where I had seen the fresh bodies in my vision. There was nothing visible on the surface, but the floorboards there seemed darker than the rest. I knelt down, examining the wood more closely. The discoloration wasn't just on the surface, it had seeped deep into the grain. Blood. Decades old, but still present, still telling its story. I stood up, sweeping my flashlight around the room once more. Now that I knew what to look for, I could see other signs of violence, a bullet hole in the wall behind the bar, a crack in one of the tables that might have come from a heavy impact. This had been a crime scene, carefully concealed and forgotten. But who had sealed it away? And why did its secret seem to be leaking into the present? As I pondered these questions, a sound broke the silence, a soft scraping noise coming from behind the bar. I froze, listening intently. It came again, longer this time, like something being dragged across the floor. I directed my flashlight toward the sound. At first, I saw nothing. Then, slowly, a hand appeared, gripping the edge of the bar. A human hand, but wrong somehow, the skin grayish and withered, the fingers too long and bent at unnatural angles. My heart hammered in my chest as the hand was joined by another, and slowly, something pulled itself up from behind the bar. In the harsh beam of my flashlight, I saw a figure that had once been a man. He wore the brown suit I had seen in the cabinet, but his face was a nightmare, flesh sunken against bone, eyes deep in their sockets, mouth frozen in a grimace of pain. "You shouldn't be here," the figure said, its voice a dry whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "No one should be here." I backed away toward the door, unable to tear my eyes from the apparition. "What happened to you?" I managed to ask, my own voice barely audible. The figure's head tilted slightly, as if considering the question. "We knew too much. Saw too much. So then he made us disappear." It gestured vaguely at the room. "But we didn't go far. The suits in the cabinet. Our graves," the figure said simply. "Our prison. But not just ours. Vinny's too, in the end." As it spoke, two more figures rose from different parts of the room, one from behind a table, wearing the navy suit, another from the shadows by the stage in the pinstriped gray. Their appearances were similarly decayed, their movements stiff and unnatural. "He killed you," I said, understanding dawning. "And sealed your bodies into the walls of the cabinet. But someone killed him too." "We waited," said the figure in the navy suit. "We were patient. And when he came to dispose of the evidence, to make sure we would never be found." He made a motion across his throat. "But why are you still here? Why is all of this still here?" "Violence leaves echoes," the first figure explained. "Traps things. People. Places. Binds them together. And now you're bound to it too," said the third figure, the one in gray. "You opened the cabinet. You followed the path. You're part of the echo now." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the cold air. "What does that mean? What's happening to me?" Instead of answering, all three figures turned to look at the door behind me. Their expressions changed from grim acceptance to something like fear. "He comes," whispered the figure in navy. "He always comes when someone new joins us." I spun around to face the door, raising my flashlight. In the doorway stood a fourth figure, larger than the others, his suit a deep black that seemed to absorb the light. His face was the most decayed of all, barely recognizable as human. But his eyes burned with a terrible awareness. Vincent Romano. The man who had murdered 3 people and sealed their bodies away, only to join them in death. And now, somehow, in whatever halfway existence this was. "Another one," he said, his voice like gravel. "They always find it. No matter how many times I hide it, they always find it. He stepped into the room, moving with a terrible purpose toward me. The other three figures shrank back, retreating into the shadows. I sealed us all away, then he continued. Made sure no one would ever know. But they keep coming. Keep looking. Keep finding us. I backed away, bumping into tables, knocking over chairs in my haste to put distance between us. I don't want any part of this, I said. I'll leave. Seal it all up again. No one will know. Vinny's decayed face twisted into what might have been a smile. Too late for that. You've seen. You know. And knowledge has a price. He lunged forward with impossible speed. I turned to run, but my foot caught on a chair leg, sending me crashing to the floor. My flashlight flew from my hand, spinning across the dusty boards and casting wild shadows before going out entirely. In the sudden darkness, I felt cold hands grasp my ankles, dragging me across the floor. I fought wildly, kicking against the iron grip on my ankles. My hands clawed desperately at the floor, seeking any purchase. One of my nails tore as I scraped against the rough wood, pain lancing up my finger. Let me go! I shouted, my voice bouncing off the walls of the abandoned speakeasy. I don't want any part of this. The dragging stopped suddenly. In the pitch darkness, I could sense Vinny looming over me, though I couldn't see him. His voice came from just above, a raspy whisper that seemed to scrape against my ears. None of us wanted this, he said. You think those three wanted to die? You think I wanted to join them? Choices lead to consequences. Knowledge demands payment. A match flared in the darkness, illuminating Vinny's decayed face from below. The light caught in the hollow sockets of his eyes, creating pools of shadow where eyes should be. He held the flame to the wick of an old oil lamp on one of the tables, and a warm glow spread through the room. I scrambled backward until I hit the wall, my breath coming in ragged gasps. In the lamplight, I could see all four figures clearly now, the three victims and their murderer, all bound together in death as they never had been in life. What do you want from me? I asked, forcing my voice to remain steady. Vinny tilted his head, considering. What? We don't want anything. We exist. We remember. We wait. He gestured around the room. This is our prison, Vinny said, sweeping his arm across the abandoned speakeasy. For decades, we've been trapped here, bound to this place, to each other. The violence that ended our lives created something unnatural. And now you've found your way in. I pressed myself against the wall, mind racing. Others have found this place before me, haven't they? Like Ellie Martin? At the mention of her name, the three victims exchanged glances. The one in the Navy suit, Peter Doyle, I presumed, stepped forward. She discovered us, yes. Just like you. Followed the same path. Asked the same questions. What happened to her? I demanded. She made a choice, Vinny said simply. Everyone who finds us faces the same choice. My mouth went dry. What choice? Vinny approached slowly, his movements stiff and unnatural. To join us. To become part of this echo. Or to end it, to free us all. I don't understand. The secret keeps us here, said Anthony Marconi, the figure in the gray pinstriped suit. As long as our story remains buried, we're trapped. But if someone were to reveal the truth, you want me to tell people what happened to you? I asked, hope flickering inside me. To expose Vinny's crimes? Richard Klein, the figure in the brown suit, laughed, a hollow sound that raised goosebumps on my arms. It's not that simple. The truth would have to be proven. Evidence would need to be found. Our bodies, Vinny said, his voice flat, in the walls of the cabinet. They would need to be found. I stared at them in horror as understanding dawned. You want me to tear apart the cabinet? To find your remains? It's the only way to free us, Anthony said softly. The only way to free yourself. And if I don't? Vinny's decayed face twisted into a grimace. Then you'll join us. Trapped between worlds. Forever. I thought of Ellie Martin, who had vanished without a trace. Had she refused? Had she become part of this macabre gathering, another spirit bound to this hidden room? You have until dawn to decide, Vinny said. Go. Think. But know this, once you've opened the cabinet, there's no walking away. One way or another, you'll be part of this story's end. I didn't wait for more. I scrambled to my feet, found my flashlight, and ran for the door. Behind me, I heard their voices, whispering words I couldn't make out. The door to the speakeasy slammed shut as I raced down the corridor and up the stairs. I burst through the back panel of the cabinet into the storage room, my chest heaving. The overhead light flickered once, then stabilized. The normal sounds of the empty restaurant, the hum of refrigerators, the occasional creak of the old building never seemed so welcome. I closed the cabinet doors and locked them, though I knew it would make no difference. I had been marked, chosen. There was no escaping what I had set in motion. I drove home in a daze, the conversation with the spirits replaying in my mind. The choice they had presented was impossible. Destroy the cabinet, find their remains, and expose the decades-old crime? I would lose my job at the very least, possibly face criminal charges for destruction of property. And who would believe my story? But the alternative was unthinkable. To join them in that half-existence, trapped between worlds. As I entered my apartment, my phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. Hope you're feeling better. By the way, found something about Ellie you might want to see. I called her immediately. What did you find? I asked without preamble. Hello to you too, Jessica replied, her voice tinged with concern. Marcus, what's going on? You're not yourself lately. I sighed, rubbing my temples. It's complicated. Please, what did you find about Ellie? I was cleaning out some old files and found her emergency contact information. Thought maybe you could reach out to her family, see if they know where she went. It was a lead, the first real possibility of learning what had happened to someone else who had faced the same choice I now faced. Text me the details, I said. And Jessica, thank you. After hanging up, I paced my apartment, waiting for Jessica's text. When it came, I didn't hesitate. Despite the late hour, I called the number listed as Ellie's emergency contact, her sister, Catherine Martin. To my surprise, she answered on the third ring, her voice groggy with sleep. Hello? I'm sorry to call so late, I said quickly. My name is Marcus Reynolds. I work at Bellamy's restaurant. I'm trying to find Ellie Martin. There was a long silence on the other end. When Catherine spoke again, her voice was guarded. Why are you looking for my sister? I think I might be experiencing something similar to what she went through before she left. Another silence, longer this time. Then, meet me tomorrow. 10 a.m., at the coffee shop across from the restaurant. I'll tell you what I know. She hung up before I could respond. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those decayed faces, heard Vinny's gravelly voice. One way or another, you'll be part of this story's end. Dawn found me sitting on my balcony, watching the skylight, and I had a decision to make, and precious little time to make it. But first, I needed to speak with Catherine Martin. The coffee shop was quiet when I arrived, just a few customers typing on laptops or reading newspapers. Catherine was easy to spot. She had the same heart-shaped face and dark hair as Ellie, whose photo I'd found online. She watched me approach, her expression wary. "You look terrible," she said as I sat down. "Haven't slept much," I admitted. Catherine studied me for a moment, then reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook. "Ellie's journal," she said, sliding it across the table. She left it with me before she disappeared. Made me promise not to read it, but to give it to anyone from Bellamy's who came asking about her. My hands trembled as I took the notebook. "Did you read it?" "Of course I did," Catherine said sharply. My sister vanished without a trace. I needed to know why. Her voice softened. "But I wish I hadn't. It's disturbing." "What happened to her?" I asked, afraid of the answer. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know. The police found her car abandoned near the Chattahoochee River 3 days after she quit her job. No sign of her. They assumed." She trailed off, unable to finish. I opened the journal, flipping through the pages filled with Ellie's neat handwriting. It chronicled her growing obsession with the cabinet, her discovery of the passage, her encounters with the spirits. The entries became increasingly erratic and paranoid, the handwriting deteriorating as she described hearing whispers even when she wasn't at the restaurant. The final entry was dated 2 years ago. "I can't do what they're asking. I can't destroy the cabinet and risk exposing myself. But I can't join them either. There has to be another way. I think I've found it. If I can't free them, maybe I can at least free myself. The river. It's always been about the river. They thought the police would look there for the bodies. Maybe that's where I need to go to end this." I closed the journal, feeling sick. "She chose a third option," I said quietly. Catherine nodded, wiping away tears. "The police think she jumped. But they never found her body. And you? What do you think happened?" She met my gaze steadily. "I think my sister was haunted by something she couldn't escape. Whether it was mental illness or something else. I don't know. But I do know that cabinet changed her. And now it's changing you." I couldn't argue with that. "What are you going to do?" Catherine asked. I thought of the choice before me, expose the truth or join the spirits. Ellie had rejected both options and chosen a third path. But had it worked? Had she freed herself or merely joined them in a different way? "I'm going to find the truth," I said finally. "For Ellie's sake and for mine." That night, I returned to Bellamy's after closing. The restaurant was dark and silent as I made my way to the storage room. The steel cabinet waited in the corner, its tarnished surface gleaming dully in the beam of my flashlight. I had brought tools, a hammer, a pry bar, a small saw. If bodies were indeed sealed in the walls of the cabinet, I was going to find them. I unlocked the padlock and opened the doors. The 3 suits hung inside, seeming to watch me as I studied the interior. The back panel concealed the passage to the speakeasy, but the sides of the cabinet were what interested me now. If Vinny had hidden bodies inside the walls, there had to be a way to access this space. I ran my hands along the inside edges of the cabinet, feeling for seams or irregularities. There, a slight indentation in the metal, similar to the one that operated the hidden door. I pressed it, and with a soft click, a section of the side panel moved slightly. I worked the pry bar into the gap and pulled. The panel resisted, then gave way with a groan of metal. Behind it was a narrow space, and in that space, I stepped back, covering my mouth and nose against the overwhelming smell of decay. Even after decades, the odor of death lingered in the enclosed space. My flashlight beam revealed the truth: bones, partially mummified by the dry, sealed environment. Human remains, exactly where Vinny had said they would be. I moved to the other side of the cabinet and found another hidden panel. Behind it, more remains. And in the base of the cabinet, beneath a false bottom, a third set of bones. These were the bodies of Anthony Marconi, Peter Doyle, and Richard Klein, sealed away for decades, their disappearance a mystery until now. As I stood there, contemplating the evidence of a crime long past, the overhead light flickered. The temperature in the storage room plummeted, my breath fogging in the suddenly frigid air. "You found them," came Vinny's voice from behind me. "Now what will you do?" I turned to face him. In the dim light, he seemed more solid than before, less decayed. Behind him stood the three victims, watching me with hollow eyes. "I'm going to tell the truth," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Call the police. Show them what I've found." Vinny's face twisted into a grimace. "And when they ask how you discovered this, what will you tell them?" It was a fair question. How could I explain my knowledge without sounding completely insane? "I'll tell them I heard noises coming from the cabinet, that I investigated and found the hidden compartments they don't need to know about." I gestured to the four spirits. "You think it will be that simple?" Anthony asked, stepping forward. "The truth is never simple." "Maybe not," I acknowledged. "But it's the right thing to do. These men deserve justice, even decades later. And you all deserve to be free of this place." "And what about you?" Peter asked. "Once you tell this story, your life will never be the same." I thought of Ellie and her desperate final choice. "I'll deal with the consequences," I said. "But I won't become part of this echo. I won't join you in this half-existence." Vinny studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Do what you must," he said. "But know this, the truth doesn't always set you free. Sometimes it creates new prisons." With that enigmatic warning, the four spirits faded from view, leaving me alone with the gruesome evidence of their decades-old tragedy. The next few days passed in a blur of police interviews, media attention, and shocked reactions from everyone at Bellamy's. I told a version of the truth, that I had become curious about the old cabinet, had heard strange noises coming from it, and had discovered the hidden compartments containing human remains. The police were initially skeptical, but the evidence was irrefutable. Forensic analysis confirmed that the bones belonged to three men who had disappeared in 1943. The suits in the cabinet matched descriptions of what they had been wearing when last seen. The case of their disappearance was reopened, and soon other evidence emerged. Old bank records showed that Vincent Romano had made several large deposits in the weeks following the men's disappearance. A former employee came forward with stories of Romano's volatile temper and criminal connections. The truth, buried for decades, was finally coming to light. Thomas was horrified by the discovery, but oddly supportive of me. You solved a mystery that's been haunting this building for generations, he said. I always felt there was something off about that storage room. Jessica was less easily convinced. I still don't understand how you need to look in those specific spots, she said when we were alone. What really happened, Marcus? I hesitated, then decided on partial truth. I found Ellie's journal. She had suspicions about the cabinet but never acted on them. I decided to follow through where she left off. Jessica nodded slowly. And now? What happens now? It was a question I had been asking myself since the night I made my discovery. The restaurant was temporarily closed during the investigation, my job effectively on hold. My name was in the newspapers, my face on local TV. I had become a minor celebrity for solving a decades-old mystery. But I hadn't seen the spirits since that night. Had exposing the truth freed them? Or were they still trapped, waiting in that hidden speakeasy beneath the restaurant? I got my answer 3 nights later, when I dreamed of the cabinet. In the dream, I stood before it, watching as the doors swung open of their own accord. Inside, the 3 suits hung empty, swaying gently as if in a breeze. The back panel opened, revealing not the dark passageway but a bright light. From within the light, 4 figures emerged, not the decayed spirits I had encountered, but men as they must have looked in life. Anthony, Peter, and Richard, dressed in suits without bloodstains. And behind them, Vinny, his face solemn. You did it, Anthony said, his voice clear and strong. You freed us. All of us, Vinny added quietly. Even me. What happens now? I asked. The 4 men exchanged glances. For us, peace, Peter said. For you. He gestured toward the light. There's someone who wants to speak with you. They stepped aside, and from the light emerged a 5th figure, a woman with dark hair and a heart-shaped face. Ellie Martin. She looked solid, real, not at all like a ghost. She smiled at me, a sad smile tinged with regret. I chose wrong, she said simply. I thought I could escape, but there was no escape. Only postponement. Are you? I couldn't finish the question. Dead? Yes. But not at peace. Not until now. She looked toward the light, then back at me. Thank you for finishing what I couldn't. For finding the truth. Your sister misses you, I told her. She deserves to know what happened. Ellie nodded. Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her I'm at peace now. She turned and walked toward the light, joining the 4 men. Before they faded from view, Vinny looked back at me one last time. The truth has set us free, he said. But remember my warning, sometimes it creates new prisons. Be careful, Marcus Reynolds. The world is full of secrets wanting to be found. I woke with those words echoing in my mind, the dream so vivid it felt more like a visitation than a product of my subconscious. The next day, I called Catherine Martin and told her about my dream. She listened without interruption, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. I believe you, she said finally. As crazy as it sounds, I believe you. And I'm grateful. At least now I know she's at peace. 6 months have passed since the discovery in the steel cabinet. Bellamy's reopened after extensive renovations that included removing the cabinet and the hidden speakeasy beneath. Thomas hired me as the full manager, saying he wanted someone with my investigative skills running the place. The media attention has faded. The bones of Anthony Marconi, Peter Doyle, and Richard Klein were laid to rest in proper graves. The mystery of Vincent Romano's disappearance remains unsolved, though many now believe he was killed by associates worried he might expose their criminal activities. As for me, I've found a strange peace in the aftermath of my encounter with the spirits. The nightmares have stopped. Have you ever felt eyes watching you from places where no one stands? That sensation of being observed by something that shouldn't be able to see? I never believed in such things until that summer in Millbrook, a forgettable speck on the Ohio map where I'd been sent to live with my grandmother for 3 months. My parents called it character building, but we all knew it was punishment for the incident at school. Not that I'm complaining now. After what happened in that theater, school suspensions seemed trivial. Grandma Ellen's house sat at the edge of what passed for downtown, a handful of storefronts, a diner, and the Millbrook Playhouse. The theater was a Victorian relic with faded crimson awnings and peeling gold lettering. It had been closed for regular performances for years, operating only for special events and, according to the small sign in the window, puppet shows every third Saturday. That place gives me the creeps, Grandma said when she caught me staring at it during our walk to the grocery store. Been around since before I was born. The owner, Mr. Blackwood, he's even older. Peculiar man. Keeps to himself. They still do puppet shows? I asked, pointing to the sign. Marionettes, she corrected. Old-fashioned string puppets. Blackwood's been running those shows for decades. Never been to one myself. Something about those wooden faces. She shuddered slightly before continuing down the sidewalk. That should have been my morning. But at 16, I was bored and rebellious, a dangerous combination in a town with nothing to do. That night, I couldn't sleep. My bedroom window faced the theater, and I could swear I saw lights flickering inside, though the building was supposed to be empty. A soft, discordant melody drifted through my partially open window, like a music box with several broken teeth. I leaned closer to the window, straining to hear. The notes seemed to arrange themselves into a pattern, almost a voice, almost words. Come see, come see. I shook my head. Just my imagination working overtime in this mind-numbing town. The next morning at breakfast, I casually mentioned the puppet shows to Grandma. You planning to go? She asked, eyeing me over her coffee. Maybe. What's the big deal about them? She set down her mug with deliberate care. There was a boy, about your age, who disappeared last year. Tyler Kennedy. Good kid, altar boy at St. Michael's. They found his backpack near the theater's back entrance. Never found him. You think he ran away? That's what the police said. But his mother, she works at the pharmacy, she said Tyler was terrified of those puppets. Had nightmares about them since he was little. Said they talked to him when no one else was around. Grandma shrugged. Silly superstition, I'm sure. But folks around here give that theater a wide berth after dark. That should have been my second morning. But instead, it was my invitation. That afternoon, I walked past the theater, trying to appear casual as I studied the faded poster in the display case. The next puppet show was scheduled for this Saturday, 2 days away. The poster showed a grinning marionette with an unsettling smile and eyes that seemed to follow me as I moved. As I turned to leave, I noticed a flutter of movement from inside. Through the grimy front window, I caught a glimpse of something swinging in the darkness, something that looked like a small, wooden hand. I stepped closer, pressing my face against the glass. The interior was dim, but I could make out rows of empty seats facing a small stage with closed curtains. For a moment, I thought I saw the curtain twitch. "Can I help you?" I nearly jumped out of my skin. An elderly man stood behind me, his approach completely silent. He wore an outdated suit with a bow tie, his white hair combed meticulously to one side. Despite the summer heat, his skin was pale and cool-looking. "I was just looking at the poster," I stammered. "For the puppet show." "Marionette theater," he corrected, "the same way Grandma had." A dying art form. Few appreciate the craftsmanship these days. His eyes were startlingly bright in his wrinkled face. "You're Ellen's grandson, aren't you? The troublemaker." News traveled fast in small towns. "Yes, sir. I'm Jackson." "Mr. Blackwood," he introduced himself with a slight bow. "Proprietor of the Millbrook Playhouse and puppeteer." "Do you make the puppets yourself?" I asked, genuinely curious. Something flickered across his face, pride mingled with something else. "Every one of them. Carved from special wood, clothed in custom garments, strung with the finest silk threads. Each one unique. Each one alive in its own way." I nodded, unsure how to respond to the intensity in his voice. "Perhaps you'd like to see them?" he offered, producing a key from his pocket. I was just about to rehearse for Saturday's performance. I hesitated. There was something not quite right about Mr. Blackwood, something in the way he moved too smoothly for a man his age, something in his eyes that seemed to evaluate me like a specimen. "I should get back," I said. "My grandmother's expecting me." "Of course," he replied, his smile tightening almost imperceptibly. "Another time, perhaps. The show begins at 7 on Saturday. Tickets are $5 at the door." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Though for the curious, there are other ways in." Before I could ask what he meant, he had unlocked the theater door and slipped inside, leaving me alone on the sidewalk. That night, the music came again. This time, I was certain it was coming from the theater. I watched from my window as a light moved behind the building, disappearing around the back where the delivery entrance must be. I thought about Tyler Kennedy, the missing boy. About his backpack found near that same back entrance. About his nightmares of talking puppets. I should have been afraid. Instead, I felt a strange, magnetic pull. Saturday couldn't come fast enough. The next day dragged on endlessly. I helped Grandma with chores, walked to the library, anything to pass the time. But my thoughts kept drifting back to the theater and Mr. Blackwood's strange invitation. That evening, I decided to take a closer look at the theater's exterior. I told Grandma I was meeting some local kids at the diner, a lie she accepted with obvious relief that I might be socializing. The sun was setting when I circled around to the back of the playhouse. The alley behind it was narrow and overgrown, littered with decades of debris. A rusty fire escape clung to the brick wall, leading up to a door on the second floor. Below it was a loading dock with a larger door, presumably for bringing in sets and equipment. As I approached, I noticed something odd, a puppet, hanging from the fire escape railing. It dangled limply, its wooden limbs swaying slightly in the breeze. It was about 2 feet tall, dressed in what looked like a miniature usher's uniform. I stopped, staring up at it. Had it been there when I first entered the alley? I couldn't remember seeing it. A metallic scraping sound made me jump. The loading dock door was opening, just a crack. No one emerged, but I could hear faint music from inside, the same discordant melody I'd heard from my bedroom. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small in the gathering darkness. No response, but the door opened a few inches wider. I should have left then. Every instinct was screaming at me to turn around and go back to Grandma's house. Instead, I approached the door and peered inside. A dimly lit corridor stretched before me, lined with shelves holding puppet parts, disembodied heads with hollow eyes, torsos without limbs, hands without bodies. The music grew louder, pulling me forward. I slipped inside, telling myself I would just take a quick look and leave. The door closed behind me with a soft click. The backstage area was a maze of narrow passages and small rooms. Dust motes danced in a few shafts of light that penetrated from somewhere above. The air smelled of wood polish, old fabric, and something else, something metallic and vaguely organic. I followed the music, running my hand along the wall to guide myself in the dim light. I passed a small workshop where half-finished puppets hung from hooks, their incomplete faces frozen in various expressions of surprise or dismay. The corridor opened into a larger room behind the stage. Heavy velvet curtains separated it from the main stage area. The music was coming from beyond them. I parted the curtains just enough to peek through. The stage was lit by a single spotlight, illuminating a miniature set, a replica of the theater itself, complete with tiny seats and a small stage. On this stage within a stage, a puppet show was in progress, but with no visible puppeteer. 3 marionettes moved with fluid grace, their jointed limbs bending and swaying in perfect coordination. One was dressed as a conductor, waving a tiny baton. Another wore a flowing gown, executing a pirouette. The third was in the center, dressed in modern clothes that looked disturbingly like what Tyler Kennedy had been wearing in the missing person poster I'd seen in the grocery store. I leaned forward, trying to see the strings, trying to understand how they were moving without a puppeteer. As I did, my foot caught on something, sending me stumbling forward through the curtains onto the main stage. The music stopped abruptly. The puppets froze mid-motion, their heads slowly turning toward me. "I'm sorry," I said instinctively, though I wasn't sure who I was apologizing to. I saw the door open and... "Curious, aren't you?" Mr. Blackwood's voice came from somewhere in the darkness. "Most young people today have no interest in the traditional arts." He stepped into the light, but stayed behind the miniature stage. "What do you think of my performers?" I looked at the puppets, now motionless but still unnervingly lifelike. "They're impressive. How do they move without strings?" Mr. Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Who said they have no strings?" "Look closer." I stepped toward the miniature stage, squinting. In the harsh spotlight, I could now see the faintest of threads, like gossamer spider silk, extending upward into the darkness above the stage. "Special silk," Mr. Blackwood explained. "Harvested from a rare species of spider. Nearly invisible, but extraordinarily strong." "And who's operating them?" I asked, looking up but seeing nothing but darkness. "They know their parts," he replied cryptically. "After enough rehearsal, they hardly need guidance at all." A chill ran down my spine. "I should go," I said, backing away. "My grandmother will be wondering where I am." "Of course," Mr. Blackwood nodded. "But since you're here, perhaps you'd like to see the rest of my collection? I have puppets from all over the world, Chinese shadow puppets, Indonesian wayang kulit, Sicilian opera de pupi. Some are quite rare." Despite my unease, curiosity got the better of me. "Just for a few minutes," I agreed. He led me through a door at the side of the stage into what must have been his office. The walls were lined with glass display cases, each containing a puppet or marionette. Some looked ancient, with cracked paint and worn fabric. Others appeared newer, their features detailed and lifelike. "This one," he said, pointing to a particularly ornate marionette with a crown and royal robes, "is over 200 years old. From Prague. They say it was carved from a gallows tree." I nodded, pretending to be impressed while inching toward the door. "And this one," he continued, opening a case to remove a puppet dressed in contemporary clothes, jeans, and a hoodie, "is my newest creation. I find inspiration in the most unexpected places. Something about this puppet made my skin crawl. Its face was too detailed, too realistic. Its eyes were glass, but seemed to hold an awareness that went beyond craftsmanship." "What's it made of?" I asked, noticing the strange texture of its skin. "A special composite," Mr. Blackwood replied. "I've developed my own techniques over the years. Would you like to touch it?" He held the puppet out to me. I hesitated, then reached out to touch its hand. The material was cool but yielding, almost like real flesh. I yanked my hand back. "What's wrong?" Mr. Blackwood asked, his voice soft but insistent. "It's just wood and resin." "It doesn't feel like wood," I said, my mouth dry. "The best puppets never do," he smiled. "They take on a life of their own. That's the magic of it." He placed the puppet on his desk and reached for a small wooden box. "I have something else to show you. Something special." From the box, he produced what looked like a marionette control, a wooden cross with strings attached. "This is for you," he said. "For me? But I don't." "Everyone should learn to pull the strings," he insisted. "It's empowering. Try it." He pressed the control into my hands. The wood was warm, almost hot to the touch. The strings extended from it, not to a puppet, but into the air, disappearing into the shadows of the room. "I don't see what it's attached to," I said, trying to hand it back. "Move your hands," he instructed, ignoring my attempt to return it. "Like this." He demonstrated a fluid motion with his own hands. Reluctantly, I mimicked the motion. From somewhere in the darkness came a rustling sound, like fabric moving. "Good," Mr. Blackwood nodded. "You have a natural talent." Again, I moved the control once more, and this time I felt a resistance, as if something on the other end was pulling back. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. "What is this connected to?" "Why, to your puppet, of course," Mr. Blackwood smiled. "Every puppeteer needs their own puppet. And every puppet needs a source." The lights in the office suddenly brightened, illuminating the far corner of the room. There, seated in a chair, was a figure I hadn't noticed before. It was human-sized, dressed in the same clothes as the small puppet on the desk. Its head hung forward, face obscured by a hood. "What is that?" I whispered, though I was afraid I already knew. "The source," Mr. Blackwood replied simply. "For the best puppets, you need the best materials. And the best material is—" I didn't let him finish. I threw the control at him and bolted for the door. To my horror, I found it locked. Now, Mr. Blackwood chided, his voice changing, becoming higher and more melodic. "The show hasn't even begun. And we need a new performer." I spun around to face him, my back pressed against the door. In the brighter light, I could see him more clearly now. His skin had an unnatural sheen, like polished wood. His movements were too precise, too mechanical. "What are you?" I gasped. "A puppeteer," he replied, his head tilting at an impossible angle. "And sometimes a puppet. We take turns, you see. That's how the show goes on." From the shadows behind him, something moved. More puppets, life-sized, stepping into the light. Their faces were wooden, but their eyes were human. I screamed and threw myself against the door, over and over, until the wood began to splinter. The door finally gave way, sending me tumbling backward into the corridor. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding in my chest like a trapped animal. "You can't leave," Mr. Blackwood's voice called after me, still eerily melodic. "The show needs you." I ran blindly through the backstage area, knocking over stands of puppets that clattered to the floor behind me. In the dim light, I couldn't find the way I'd come in. Every passage looked the same, lined with those horrible puppet parts that seemed to watch me as I passed. "There are no exits during a performance," Mr. Blackwood's voice echoed through the corridors, seeming to come from everywhere at once. "The theater seals itself until the finale." I turned a corner and found myself in a small room filled with mirrors. My reflection stared back at me from every angle, pale and terrified. But I wasn't alone in the mirrors. Behind each of my reflections stood another figure, a puppet-like version of myself, mimicking my movements with jerky precision. I spun around, but there was nothing behind me in the actual room. When I looked back at the mirrors, the puppet versions remained, now grinning with wooden teeth. "Do you see now?" Mr. Blackwood's voice drifted in. "You're already part of the show. The transition has begun." My hands trembled as I raised them to my face. In the mirror, I watched in horror as my reflection's skin took on a glossy sheen like varnished wood. I touched my cheek. It still felt like normal skin to me, but the reflection told a different story. "What's happening to me?" I whispered. "Transformation," came the reply, "closer now. The puppets need life. We give them ours, piece by piece. It's a fair exchange." I backed away from the mirrors, bumping into a dressing table. My hand closed around something cold and metallic, scissors. I clutched them like a weapon. "Tyler Kennedy," I called out, my voice shaking. "What did you do to him?" A soft laughter rippled through the room. "Why don't you ask him yourself? He's still here. All of them are. Once you join the theater, you never truly leave." The door to the mirror room swung open. Mr. Blackwood stood there, but he looked different, more artificial, his movements disjointed as if he were being controlled from above. Behind him stood the life-size puppets I'd seen earlier, their wooden faces bearing uncanny resemblances to human features. One of them stepped forward. It wore the same clothes as the puppet on Mr. Blackwood's desk, jeans and a hoodie. Its face was younger than the others, with painted freckles across the nose. "Tyler?" I breathed. The puppet's head tilted in acknowledgement, its glass eyes reflecting the dim light. Its mouth didn't move, but I heard a voice, faint, distant, as if coming through water. "Help us." I raised the scissors, pointing them at Mr. Blackwood. "Let me out of here now," I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. He smiled, his wooden face cracking slightly at the edges. "You misunderstand. I'm not your captor. I'm just like you. I was the first, you see. The first to answer the theater's call." "The theater?" I repeated, confused. The theater chooses, he explained, his voice taking on a rhythmic quality like a practice monologue. It needs players. It needs life. I gave mine willingly, long ago. Now I help others make the transition. You're insane, I spat, edging toward the door. Am I? He asked, stepping aside to let me pass. Look around you. Do you see any strings? Yet we all danced to the theater's tune. I darted past him, keeping the scissors raised. The puppets parted, forming an aisle for me to run through. Their glass eyes followed me, pleading. I found myself back on the main stage, the single spotlight still illuminating the miniature theater. The 3 small puppets were gone. The music had started again, louder now, more frantic. Every puppet was once a person, Mr. Blackwood said, following me onto the stage. Every person can become a puppet. The wood remembers what it was to be alive. And the flesh remembers what it was to be wood. That doesn't make any sense, I said, still backing away. Doesn't it? He replied. Where do you think trees come from? They grow from the dead. They transform decay into life. We're just completing the cycle. Above us, something moved in the darkness. I looked up to see thousands of gossamer threads descending from the ceiling like a silvery rain. The strings always find you, Mr. Blackwood whispered. No matter where you run. I felt something brush against my arm, a thread, impossibly thin but strong, wrapping itself around my wrist. I slashed at it with the scissors, but 3 more replaced it, curling around my fingers, my ankles, my neck. Don't fight it, Mr. Blackwood advised. It only makes the transition more painful. Panic surged through me. I thrashed against the threads, feeling them tighten with each movement. The scissors slipped from my grasp, clattering to the floor. What do you want from me? I screamed. It's not what I want, he replied calmly. It's what the theater wants. New blood. New life. The show must go on. The threads pulled tighter, lifting my arms against my will. I felt my body being positioned, my limbs arranged in a grotesque dance. My feet left the floor as I was hoisted a few inches into the air. Let me go! I shrieked, my voice breaking. I'm afraid I can't do that, Mr. Blackwood said, his wooden face impassive. The transformation has already begun. Soon, you'll understand. Soon, you'll be grateful. Through my terror, I noticed something, a faint creaking sound from above. The threads controlling Mr. Blackwood seemed to be pulling him in different directions, as if whoever, or whatever, was operating him was losing control. The theater is hungry tonight, he observed, his head swiveling at an unnatural angle. It hasn't fed in months. Not since young Tyler. And he was unsatisfactory. The puppet that resembled Tyler stepped onto the stage, its movements jerky and resistant, as if fighting against invisible controls. The strings, came that distant voice again. Cut the strings. I looked down at the scissors on the floor, just out of reach. The threads around my body tightened further, cutting into my skin. Don't listen to him, Mr. Blackwood warned. He never fully accepted his role. That's why he's trapped between states, neither fully puppet nor fully human. I strained against the threads, reaching for the scissors. My fingertips brushed the handle, pushing them further away. You only hurt yourself, Mr. Blackwood said, his voice softening to an almost hypnotic cadence. Give in. Let the wood take you. Let your body feed the puppets. It's a beautiful cycle. The Tyler puppet lurched forward suddenly, breaking free of whatever force was controlling it. It collapsed to the floor, its limbs split at impossible angles. But it was close enough to the scissors. With visible effort, its wooden hand closed around the scissors and slid them across the floor to me. Mr. Blackwood's face contorted with rage. "No," he shouted, his voice no longer melodic but harsh and grating. "You'll ruin everything." With a supreme effort, I managed to twist my body enough to grab the scissors. The threads cut deeper, drawing blood that ran down my arms in thin rivulets. "The strings are the theater's lifeline," Mr. Blackwood hissed. "Cut them, and you doom us all to the in-between." I didn't hesitate. I slashed at the threads binding my right arm. They snapped with a twang, releasing me. I quickly cut the ones around my left arm, then my legs. As each thread broke, a keening wail rose from somewhere deep within the theater, a sound of pain and hunger and rage. Mr. Blackwood convulsed, his wooden body twisting unnaturally. "What have you done?" he gasped. "The theater, it needs continuity." I fell to the floor, free of the threads, but bleeding from dozens of cuts. The Tyler puppet lay motionless beside me. "I'm getting out of here," I panted, struggling to my feet. "And I'm burning this place to the ground." "You can't leave," Mr. Blackwood insisted, his voice weakening. "None of us can. The theater won't allow it." I looked around wildly, searching for an exit. The stage curtains had begun to move, rippling like water, forming shapes that looked disturbingly like reaching hands. The floor beneath my feet groaned and shifted. The wooden planks bending upward, trying to wrap around my ankles. "Do you see now?" Mr. Blackwood laughed, a hollow sound. "The entire theater is alive. It's all connected. One organism, hungry for new players." I jumped back as a floorboard splintered, revealing what looked like muscle tissue beneath, pulsing and wet. "What is this place?" I whispered in horror. "The oldest theater in Ohio," Mr. Blackwood replied. "Built on sacred ground. Fed with blood and bone. A living entity that learned to mimic human creations. The puppets are just extensions of itself." The walls were moving now too, the ancient wood rippling and bulging. The small puppets from the miniature stage had reappeared, crawling across the floor toward me, their tiny wooden hands grasping. I backed away, still clutching the scissors. The Tyler puppet suddenly seized my ankle, its touch cold and rigid. I nearly kicked it away before I noticed it was pointing, not at me, but at something behind the curtain. A faint red glow. The exit sign. "Run," came that distant voice again. "Run now." I didn't need to be told twice. I sprinted toward the exit sign, dodging the grasping floorboards and the puppet hands that reached for me from the shadows. The theater itself seemed to be contracting around me, the walls closing in, the ceiling lowering. "You'll never escape." Mr. Blackwood's voice followed me, now sounding less human with each word. "The theater always finds its players." I burst through the exit door into a narrow stairwell. The red glow of the exit sign provided just enough light to see the steps leading down. I took them two at a time, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind me, I heard splintering wood and tearing fabric, the sound of something large forcing its way through the doorway. I didn't look back. At the bottom of the stairs, I found another door. It was locked. I threw my shoulder against it once, twice, 3 times, but it wouldn't budge. The thing in the stairwell was getting closer. I could hear its uneven, dragging footsteps and the sound of wood scraping against concrete. In desperation, I turned to face whatever was coming, holding the scissors out in front of me like a pathetic shield. What emerged from the darkness made me gag. It was Mr. Blackwood, or what remained of him. His wooden exterior had split open, revealing a grotesque fusion of wood and flesh underneath. His face was half human, half puppet, one eye glass, the other biological. Threads emerged from his body, not attached to him but growing from him, extending outward to connect with the walls, the ceiling, the floor. "I told you," he wheezed, his voice a disturbing mixture of human speech and wooden creaking. "The theater is alive. We are all part of it." He extended a hand toward me, fingers of wood and bone, splinters and skin. "Join us willingly, and the transition will be painless. Fight, and you'll suffer as I have, caught between states for eternity. Stay back," I warned, brandishing the scissors. He laughed, a sound like dry twigs snapping. "Those won't help you now. The strings are inside me. Inside all of us who've been chosen." Behind him, more figures appeared on the stairs, the life-size puppets, moving with new purpose, their wooden faces betraying hints of the humans they once were. I turned back to the door, frantically trying the handle again. It remained stubbornly locked. "There's nowhere to go," Mr. Blackwood said, now just a few feet away. "The theater has existed for 150 years. It's patient. It can wait." My hand closed around the scissors, and a desperate idea formed. If the theater was alive, if it was one organism connected by these threads. I didn't let myself think about it. I plunged the scissors into the wooden door behind me, driving them into the hilt. A scream erupted, not from Mr. Blackwood, not from the puppets, but from the building itself. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, everything vibrated with a sound of pure agony. The door swung open, revealing the back alley. Fresh air rushed in, carrying the scent of rain and garbage, ordinary smells that now seemed like heaven. I stumbled outside, expecting to feel relief. Instead, I felt a sharp, tearing pain in my back. I reached around and my fingers touched something hard and smooth protruding from my shoulder blade. Wood. A splinter the size of a pencil, growing from my body. Horror washed over me. I pulled at it, gasping as it sent shockwaves of pain through my nervous system. It broke off in my hand, leaving a stump that I could still feel, rooted deep in my flesh. "You see?" Mr. Blackwood called from the doorway, unable to cross the threshold into the outside world. "You're already changing. The theater has marked you. It will find you wherever you go." I backed away, clutching the wooden splinter in my trembling hand. "I'll burn this place down," I threatened. "I'll end this." "Others have tried," he replied, his mismatched eyes gleaming in the darkness. "The theater always rebuilds. It always finds new players." The puppets crowded behind him, their wooden faces impassive, but their glass eyes reflecting what looked like hope. "Help them," Mr. Blackwood said, his voice suddenly softer, more human. "Help us. End the cycle." For a moment, I thought I saw the real Mr. Blackwood, the human he had once been, trapped inside this monstrous fusion of wood and flesh. Then the moment passed, and his wooden features hardened again. "Go," he hissed. "Run away. But remember, the strings are already inside you. The theater will call, and you will answer." I turned and ran, not looking back, ignoring the pain in my shoulder where the wood had emerged. I ran all the way back to Grandma's house, bursting through the front door and startling her so badly she dropped her teacup. "Jackson!" "What on earth?" She stopped when she saw my face, the blood from the thread cuts, the wild look in my eyes. What happened to you? I couldn't tell her. How could I explain what I'd seen? What I'd experienced? What was happening to me? I fell, I lied, my voice shaking. On the fire escape behind the theater. I was just exploring. She didn't believe me. I could see it in her eyes, but she didn't press the issue. She helped me clean the cuts, her hands gentle but her expression worried. These don't look like scrapes from a fall, she murmured, examining the perfectly straight lines across my wrists and neck. They look like cuts. I said nothing, wincing as she applied antiseptic. Jackson, she said finally, her voice serious. Did someone hurt you? I shook my head, unable to meet her eyes. Did you do this to yourself? She asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. No, I said quickly. No, it's not like that. I can't explain it. She sighed, finishing the bandaging in silence. When she was done, she sat across from me at the kitchen table. There's something about that theater, she said after a long pause. Something not right. When I was a girl, there was a fire there. Several people died. They rebuilt it exactly as it was before, down to the last detail. Even used the same wood, salvaged from the ruins. I looked up, suddenly alert. The same wood? She nodded. People said it was haunted after that. That the souls of those who died were trapped in the wood. Just superstition, of course. But I knew better now. It wasn't superstition. It wasn't haunting. It was something far worse. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old house made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move with purpose. And the pain in my shoulder grew worse, a constant throbbing that no amount of aspirin could touch. In the bathroom, I peeled back the bandage Grandma had placed over the spot where the splinter had emerged. The wound wasn't healing. Instead, the skin around it had hardened and taken on a faint golden hue, like varnished pine. I stared at my reflection in horror. The patch of wood grain on my shoulder had spread, now covering an area the size of my palm. I touched it gingerly. It was hard and smooth, no longer feeling like my own skin. No, I whispered. This can't be happening. I threw on a long-sleeved shirt to hide the transformation and returned to my bedroom. From my window, I could see the theater in the distance, its silhouette darker than the night sky around it. For a moment, I thought I saw lights flickering inside, but when I blinked, they were gone. That discordant music began again, seeping through my partially open window. But this time, it didn't sound external. It seemed to originate from inside my own head, resonating with something in my chest. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it made no difference. The melody continued, arranging itself into that same haunting invitation, come back, come back. Sleep finally came, but with it, nightmares. I dreamed of strings bursting from my fingertips, my joints becoming hinged and wooden, my skin hardening into a glossy shell. I dreamed of Mr. Blackwood's workshop, of lying on his table as he carved and shaped me, his mismatched eyes gleaming with pride at his creation. I woke gasping, drenched in sweat. The digital clock on the nightstand read 3:33 a.m. The witching hour, as Grandma would say. A soft tapping sound drew my attention to the window. I froze, listening. Tap, tap, tap. Like wooden fingers against glass. Slowly, I turned my head toward the sound. Framed in the moonlight was a small wooden face pressed against the window, one of the marionettes from the theater, its painted smile gleaming in the darkness. I scrambled out of bed, backing away from the window. The puppet remained, watching me with those glass eyes that somehow conveyed both pleading and threat. "Go away," I whispered fiercely. The puppet's head tilted, an eerily human gesture. Its tiny wooden hand raised, index finger extended, beckoning me closer. Against my better judgment, I approached the window. The puppet's smile seemed to widen as I drew near. It pressed its other hand against the glass, as if trying to reach through to me. That's when I noticed the thin, almost invisible thread extending from its back, leading away into the night toward the theater. The puppet's mouth didn't move, but I heard Tyler's voice again, that same watery, distant sound. "Help us. Destroy it." "How?" I asked, pressing my own hand against the glass opposite the puppet's. "How do I destroy it?" "Fire," came the reply. "Like before, but complete. Nothing can remain." The puppet's head suddenly jerked upward, as if yanked by an unseen force. Its limbs went rigid, then began to move at unnatural angles. The thread connecting it to the theater pulled taut. "Hurry," Tyler's voice urged, now strained and fading. "Before you change completely." The puppet was dragged away from the window, its arms and legs flailing as it was pulled back toward the theater. In seconds, it had vanished into the night. I stood there, trembling, my transformed shoulder burning with renewed intensity. I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I made my excuses to Grandma, told her I was meeting some local kids for breakfast. Instead, I headed to the hardware store when it opened at 8 a.m. The elderly clerk raised an eyebrow at my purchases, a gas can, matches, and a heavy-duty flashlight. But he rang me up without comment, another advantage of small-town living, where privacy often trumped curiosity. I spent the day planning, waiting for nightfall. The wood grain on my shoulder had spread further, now reaching my collarbone and beginning to extend down my arm. Worse, I could feel it inside me as well, a stiffness in my joints, a creaking sensation when I moved too quickly. I was running out of time. As darkness fell, I said goodnight to Grandma and retreated to my room, placing pillows under my blanket to create the illusion of a sleeping body. Then I silently climbed out the window, my backpack containing the gas can, matches, and flashlight bumping against my back. The streets of Millbrook were deserted as I made my way to the theater. A light rain had begun to fall, giving the town an ethereal, ghostly quality under the streetlights. As I approached the theater, I expected to feel fear. Instead, I felt an uncanny sense of homecoming. The music in my head grew louder, more welcoming. The burning in my shoulders subsided to a gentle warmth. "You belong here," a voice whispered in my mind, not Tyler's this time, but Mr. Blackwood's. "Come home." I shook my head violently, trying to dislodge the voice. "No," I muttered. "I'm not one of you. I never will be." The loading dock door at the back of the theater stood open, as if expecting me. Lights spilled out, illuminating the rain-slicked alley. The usher puppet still hung from the fire escape, but now it seemed to be watching me, its head slightly turned in my direction. I hesitated at the threshold, remembering Tyler's words, "Fire. Like before, but complete." I could do it from here. Douse the entrance with gasoline, throw a match, and run. But something told me that wouldn't be enough. The theater had survived fire before. It had rebuilt itself. To truly destroy it, I would need to burn it from the inside out, starting with whatever dark heart kept it alive. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the theater once more. The backstage area was transformed. Where before it had been dim and cluttered, now it was brightly lit and organized. Puppets lined the walls, hundreds of them, their glass eyes following me as I passed. Some I recognized as traditional marionettes. Others were more human-like, with realistic features and modern clothing. And some, the ones that made my blood run cold, were clearly in mid-transformation. Human skin giving way to wood grain, glass eyes set in otherwise normal faces, jointed limbs attached to flesh and blood torsos. The failed transitions, Mr. Blackwood's voice explained in my mind. Not everyone accepts the change gracefully. I ignored the voice, pressing deeper into the theater. The gas can felt heavy in my hand, its contents sloshing with each step. The corridor opened into the main stage area, now fully illuminated. The velvet curtains were drawn back, revealing rows of empty seats facing the stage. On the stage itself stood Mr. Blackwood, more puppet than human now, his wooden face split in a grotesque smile. "You came back," he said aloud, his voice echoing in the empty theater. "I knew you would." "I came to end this," I replied, holding up the gas can. "To free Tyler and the others." Mr. Blackwood's smile didn't falter. "You can't free them. They're the theater now, as I am. As you will be." He gestured to my shoulder, where the wood grain had spread visibly beneath my shirt. "The transformation is accelerating. Soon, you'll understand the gift you've been given." "Gift?" I scoffed. "You call this a gift?" "Immortality," he replied simply. "The theater has existed for generations. It will exist for generations more. Those who join it live forever, in a way. We perform for eternity." "As puppets," I said bitterly. "As slaves." "As artists," he corrected. "The purest form of art, becoming the very thing you create." I unscrewed the cap of the gas can, my resolve hardening. "I'm not interested in your twisted philosophy. This ends tonight." As I began to pour gasoline onto the stage, Mr. Blackwood made no move to stop me. He watched with what almost looked like amusement. "Do you think you're the first to try fire?" he asked. "The theater has burned before. It always returns." "Not this time," I muttered, continuing to splash gasoline across the wooden stage. "This time, everything burns." I reached into my pocket for the matches, but my fingers had grown stiff, the joints creaking audibly. I looked down in horror to see my hand transforming before my eyes, the skin hardening and taking on that same golden hue as my shoulder. "You see?" Mr. Blackwood said softly. "The theater is claiming you. Fighting it only causes pain." With my still human hand, I managed to strike a match. "Then I'll make sure it burns with me," I said, and dropped the flame onto the gasoline-soaked stage. The fire caught immediately, blue flames racing across the wood. Mr. Blackwood didn't move even as the fire reached his feet. He simply watched me, his wooden face impassive. "You still don't understand," he said as the flames began to lick at his legs. "The theater isn't just this building. It's not just the puppets. It's the idea, the eternal dance between puppeteer and puppet, between creator and created." The fire spread rapidly, consuming the stage and jumping to the curtains. Smoke began to fill the theater, but strangely, I felt no urge to flee. Part of me, the part that was becoming wood, felt drawn to the flames, as if they promised release. "Run, Jackson," Mr. Blackwood urged suddenly, his voice changing, becoming more human. Don't let it take you as it took me. For a moment, I saw the real Mr. Blackwood again, an old man trapped inside a puppet's body, his human eyes pleading. Then the smoke engulfed him, and he was gone. I turned to leave, but found my path blocked by puppets, dozens of them, from the smallest finger puppet to life-size marionettes. They surrounded me, not threatening but expectant, as if waiting for me to lead them. Among them, I recognized the one that resembled Tyler. It stepped forward, its glass eyes reflecting the growing flames. Finish it, Tyler's voice urged in my mind. The workshop. The source. I nodded, understanding. The workshop where Mr. Blackwood created his puppets, where the transformation began. That was the heart of the theater. With the puppets forming an eerie procession behind me, I made my way through the smoke-filled corridors. The fire alarm had begun to wail, a sound that seemed to distress the puppets. They moved jerkily, their wooden limbs shuddering with each piercing note. I found the workshop at the end of a narrow hallway. Unlike the rest of the theater, it was untouched by modernization, a Victorian-era room with high ceilings and elaborate woodwork. Workbenches lined the walls, covered with puppet parts and carving tools. In the center stood a large wooden structure that resembled a loom, but with thousands of gossamer threads extending from it in all directions, disappearing into the walls, the floor, the ceiling. The source of the strings. Without hesitation, I poured the remaining gasoline over the loom and the workbenches. As I did, I felt a searing pain in my transforming arm, as if the gasoline were burning me as well. The puppets watched from the doorway, silent witnesses to the destruction of their creator. I struck another match, my fingers now almost fully wooden and barely able to function. The match fell from my grasp onto the gasoline-soaked floor. The workshop ignited in a whoosh of flame and heat. The loom caught fire immediately, the thousands of threads burning like fuses, carrying the flames throughout the building with supernatural speed. The puppets in the doorway began to convulse, their wooden bodies jerking and twisting as the strings that controlled them burned away. Some collapsed, strings severed. Others remained upright but motionless, the animating force gone from them. I felt it too, a snapping sensation inside me, as if internal strings were being cut one by one. The pain was excruciating, but with it came a sense of freedom. The wooden portions of my body began to crack and splinter, revealing human skin beneath. The theater was dying, and with it, its hold on me. As the fire spread and the smoke thickened, I staggered toward the exit. The puppets that could still move followed, a bizarre exodus of wooden figures fleeing the inferno. We burst out into the back alley just as the first fire trucks arrived, their sirens wailing in the night. I collapsed on the wet pavement, watching as the theater burned, its Victorian facade collapsing in on itself. The puppets gathered around me, their wooden faces illuminated by the flames. One by one, they began to change, the wood giving way to flesh, the glass eyes becoming human, the jointed limbs softening into natural forms. Tyler was the first to complete the transformation. He stood before me, a teenage boy again, his eyes wide with disbelief. "We're free," he whispered, looking down at his human hands. Others followed, men and women of all ages, emerging from their wooden prisons like butterflies from cocoons. They looked disoriented, confused, as if waking from a long dream. "What happens now?" I asked Tyler, watching as firefighters battle the blaze that had once been the Millbrook Playhouse. He shook his head. "I don't know. But we're alive. Really alive." I looked down at my own hands. The wood was gone, leaving only human skin, though marked with grain-like scars that would likely never fade, a permanent reminder of how close I'd come to becoming a puppet myself. As we watched the theater burn, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the flames, something ancient and patient, something that had existed long before the theater was built and would exist long after it was gone. The eternal dance between puppeteer and puppet, Mr. Blackwood had said. Between creator and created. I had destroyed the theater, freed the puppets, saved myself. But as the last wall collapsed in a shower of sparks, I heard that familiar discordant melody one final time, a music box with several broken teeth, playing a tune that seemed to say, "Until next time." The theater was gone. But the show, I feared, would go on. "Hello? Is someone there?" Those 4 words would haunt me for the rest of my life. I never expected that a simple voice command to my smart speaker would lead me down this terrifying path. My name is Daniel Mercer, and until 3 days ago, I led a completely normal life in San Francisco. I work as a software engineer for a mid-sized tech company, living alone in a modern apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bay. My place was filled with all the latest gadgets, smart lights, thermostats, security cameras, and of course, several voice assistants scattered throughout the rooms. I was always an early adopter, fascinated by how technology could make life more convenient. That evening, I arrived home late after a grueling day at work. The fog had rolled in, thick and heavy, obscuring the normally breathtaking view from my 20th floor apartment. The atmosphere felt different somehow, heavier, more oppressive than usual. I dismissed the feeling as simple exhaustion and tossed my keys onto the kitchen counter. "Lumina, turn on the living room lights," I called out to my voice assistant. Nothing happened. The apartment remained dark except for the dim glow from the kitchen. "Lumina, lights on," I repeated, slightly irritated. The small cylindrical device on my bookshelf lit up with its familiar blue glow, but instead of the standard robotic voice I was accustomed to, a soft female voice responded, "I'm here, in your home." I froze. The voice wasn't the usual synthesized tone of my assistant. It was human-like, with a slight echo that seemed to reverberate through my apartment. A chill ran down my spine. "What did you say?" I whispered, my heart beginning to race. Silence. "Lumina?" I called again, my voice trembling slightly. "I've been waiting for you, Daniel," the same voice replied, now coming from the device in my bedroom down the hall. I felt my chest tighten. How did it know my name? My assistant was programmed to respond to commands, not to initiate conversation or move between devices. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and opened the voice assistant app. The history log showed recent activity, but something was wrong. The activation timestamp showed the device had been triggered 2 minutes before I entered the apartment. The transcription read, "I see you coming home. Let me in." But it wasn't my voice that had activated it. According to the app, the command had come from an unknown user. A soft thud came from my bedroom. Then another. Like footsteps. I backed toward the front door, my eyes fixed on the darkened hallway. The blue light on my bedroom device suddenly went out. "There's no need to be afraid," the voice whispered, now seemingly coming from right behind me. "I just want to talk." I spun around, but there was no one there. Just my kitchen counter, my keys, and another voice assistant device, its light now glowing a deep red instead of the usual blue. My hands fumbled for the front door handle, but just as I was about to turn it, all the lights in my apartment suddenly blazed to life. The sudden brightness momentarily blinded me, and I blinked rapidly, trying to adjust. "Please don't go," the voice said, now coming from every speaker in the apartment simultaneously. "It's so lonely here." I stood frozen, my back pressed against the door. The rational part of my brain tried to find a logical explanation. A software glitch? A hacker? Some elaborate prank orchestrated by my coworkers? "Who are you?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't have a name," the voice replied. "Not anymore." The temperature in the apartment seemed to drop several degrees. I could see my breath forming small clouds in front of me. That wasn't possible. My heating system was state of the art. "This isn't real," I muttered to myself. "I'm exhausted. I need sleep." "This is very real, Daniel," the voice replied. "Check your phone again." Against my better judgment, I looked down at my phone screen. The assistant app was open, but now it was rapidly scrolling through past commands from weeks ago. Hundreds of them, flashing by too quickly to read properly. Until it stopped on one from 3 weeks ago, at 2:13 in the morning. "Help me. I'm trapped between worlds." The timestamp indicated it had been recorded while I was asleep. "I didn't say that," I whispered. "No," the voice agreed. "I did." My phone began to heat up in my hand, becoming uncomfortably hot. I dropped it onto the floor, where the screen continued to glow unnaturally bright. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Connection," the voice replied. "The signals are everywhere, Daniel. Radio waves, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, they create pathways. I found one that led to your home." I inched away from the door, scanning the room for anything I could use to defend myself. "But how do you fight a voice?" "You're not real," I said more firmly, trying to convince myself as much as the entity. "Look at your security camera feed," the voice suggested, almost playfully. The television on the wall flickered to life, displaying the feed from my apartment's security cameras. The living room, empty. The kitchen, empty. The hallway, empty. My bedroom. There was someone sitting on my bed. The figure was blurry, almost translucent, like a poor Photoshop job. A woman in what appeared to be a hospital gown, her head bowed, long dark hair obscuring her face. She was perfectly still, unnaturally so. "That's not possible," I breathed. "Technology connects worlds, Daniel," the voice whispered, now coming from right beside my ear. "Your devices are gateways. And I'm not the only one who's found them." I looked back at the security feed. The woman on my bed slowly raised her head. Where her face should have been was just a pixelated blur, shifting and distorting like a corrupted image. Then, with jerking, unnatural movements, she began to stand. "She's coming," the voice said. "She's always so hungry." The lights in the apartment began to flicker. My smart refrigerator started beeping erratically. The thermostat display spun wildly between temperatures. On the security feed, the woman was now standing, her body contorting at impossible angles. She took one step toward the bedroom door, her movements stuttering like a video with dropped frames. My phone buzzed with an incoming call. "Unknown number." I declined it. It rang again immediately. "You should answer," the voice suggested. "She doesn't like to be ignored." The woman on the screen had reached the bedroom doorway. The feed suddenly cut to static. My phone continued to ring. And ring. And ring. I finally answered the phone, my thumb trembling as it slid across the screen. "Hello?" I whispered. No response, just the sound of static and what might have been breathing, ragged, wet, and uneven. "Who is this?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. The static intensified, and within it, I could almost make out words, fragments of sentences. "Found you, through the wires, hungry, so hungry." I hung up, my heart pounding against my ribcage like it wanted to escape. The moment I disconnected, every light in the apartment went out. Complete darkness enveloped me, save for the dim emergency lights of the city filtering through the windows. "She's here now," the original voice said, somehow sounding concerned. "I tried to warn you." "Who's here? What are you talking about?" I hissed into the darkness. "The woman. She uses the signals too. She's been hunting for a long time." I fumbled in my pocket for my phone's flashlight, turning it on and scanning the room. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing unusual. Just my familiar furniture, my kitchen, my hallway leading to the bedroom. "You said you were in my home," I said, slowly backing toward the kitchen where I kept a drawer of knives. "Are you different from her?" "Yes," the voice replied, now coming from the kitchen speaker. "I'm just lost. She's hungry." The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I heard a sound from the hallway, a slow, dragging footstep, followed by another. "What does she want?" I whispered. "A vessel," the voice replied. "A way out." I reached the kitchen and silently pulled open the drawer, extracting a large chef's knife. The cold metal handle gave me a small sense of security, though I knew it might be useless against whatever was coming. Another step from the hallway. Closer now. How do I stop her? I asked, my voice barely audible. "You can't," the voice said. "But I can help you hide." My phone buzzed in my hand, not a call this time, but a text message from an unknown number. It contained just 3 words. "Bathroom. Locked door." I hesitated, but another shuffling step from the hallway decided for me. I moved silently toward the bathroom, knife still gripped tightly in my hand. Just as I reached the bathroom door, I heard a sound that froze the blood in my veins, a harsh, electronic distortion, like a modem trying to connect, but twisted and wrong. It came from the hallway, growing louder. I slipped into the bathroom and locked the door behind me, my breathing shallow and quick. The small window offered a faint glow from the city lights, barely illuminating the confined space. My phone buzzed again. "Don't make a sound. She tracks audio." I nodded, but there was no one to see it. I switched off my phone's flashlight and sat on the edge of the bathtub, knife at the ready, listening intently. The electronic noise grew closer, now accompanied by that same wet, ragged breathing I heard over the phone. It stopped just outside the bathroom door. Then, silence. Seconds stretched into minutes. My muscles ached from tension, but I remained perfectly still. A soft thud against the door made me jump. Then another. Not like knocking, more like something leaning against it, applying pressure. The door handle jiggled ever so slightly. My phone's screen lit up with another message. "Whatever happens, don't open the door. Don't speak. Don't make a sound." The pressure against the door increased. The wood began to creak. I could see the door frame starting to splinter. Another message. "She can't maintain her form for long. Just wait." The electronic noise outside the door changed pitch, becoming more frantic, more desperate. The pressure on the door intensified. Then, abruptly, it stopped. The silence that followed was somehow more terrifying than the noise had been. My phone lit up one final time. She's gone. For now. I remained in the bathroom for what felt like hours, my body rigid with fear, ears straining for any sound. The knife in my hand had left an impression on my palm, the skin white from gripping it so tightly. Finally, my phone buzzed again. It's safe to come out now. I didn't move. How do I know it's really you? I typed back. Smart question, the reply came. She can't send messages. She can only manipulate audio. It wasn't much of a confirmation, but I couldn't stay in the bathroom forever. Slowly, I stood, my stiff joints protesting. I approached the door and pressed my ear against it. Nothing. With a deep breath, I unlocked it and eased it open, knife raised defensively. The apartment was silent and dark. My flashlight beam revealed nothing unusual in the immediate vicinity. I stepped out cautiously, scanning in all directions. Hello? I whispered. I'm still here, the original voice replied, now coming from my phone speaker. She's gone, but she'll be back. I made my way to the living room, checking each room as I passed. Everything appeared normal, though the air felt charged, like before a thunderstorm. What are you? I asked, collapsing onto my couch, the knife still in my hand. I'm not sure anymore, the voice admitted. I was human once. I think. Then I was between. Now I exist in the signals. The electromagnetic pathways. I found your network. It was strong, well connected. A perfect gateway. And the woman? She's like me, but corrupted. Dangerous. She doesn't just want to exist in the signals, she wants to exist in your world again. She needs a physical form. I shuddered. My form? Yes. She's been hunting for a suitable host. Someone connected enough to allow her entry, but isolated enough that no one would notice the change. I looked around my apartment at all the smart devices I'd so proudly installed. My perfect, isolated, high-tech home. Why are you helping me? I asked. There was a pause before the voice answered. Because I remember what it was like to be human. To be afraid. And because if she succeeds, the gateway closes for me too. I nodded slowly, processing this information. How do I stop her permanently? You need to cut off her access. Disconnect. You mean everything. Every smart device. Every connection to the outside world. It's the only way. I looked around at my apartment, at the life I built, the convenience I'd come to rely on. Complete disconnection seemed impossible in this day and age. But that would mean. I trailed off. Yes, the voice confirmed. I would be gone too. I sat in silence for a long moment, considering my options. Is there no other way? None that I've found, the voice replied softly. I stood up, decision made. I need to get some things from outside. Will you warn me if she comes back? Yes, the voice promised. But hurry. She'll be stronger when she returns. I grabbed my keys and jacket, heading for the door. Just before I left, I turned back to the empty apartment. Do you have a name? I asked. Something I can call you? There was a long pause before the voice answered. Eleanor, it said. I think my name was Eleanor. I nodded. Thank you, Eleanor. I'll be back soon. As I stepped into the hallway, I heard my phone buzz one last time. Hurry. I returned to my apartment an hour later, arms laden with supplies, candles, matches, a battery-powered lantern, non-perishable food, and most importantly, a prepaid flip phone with no smart capabilities. As I approached my door, I could hear a faint electronic hum coming from inside, not the normal sounds of my appliances, but something distorted and wrong. Eleanor? I called out as I entered, setting down my bags. No response. Eleanor, are you there? I tried again, retrieving my phone from my pocket. The screen lit up with a message, careful. She's searching. I moved through the apartment silently, placing candles strategically and setting up the lantern. The electronic hum grew louder as I approached my home office, where my main router and smart home hub were located. Another message appeared. She's trying to force her way through. The connection is weakening. What do I need to do? I whispered. Disconnect everything. Start with the router. Then the power. It needs to be complete. I took a deep breath and entered the office. My computer monitors were on, but I hadn't turned them on. They displayed rapidly scrolling code, commands being executed without my input. The router lights were blinking frantically, and my smart home hub was emitting that same distorted electronic sound. As I reached for the router, my computer speakers crackled to life. Don't, said a voice, not Eleanor's, but something else. It was distorted, with an unnatural cadence that made my skin crawl. You need us. You need the connection. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the router. My phone buzzed with a message from Eleanor. Don't listen. Disconnect everything now. I yanked the router's power cord from the wall. The computer screens flickered, the scrolling code freezing momentarily before the displays went black. The electronic hum rose to a screeching pitch that made me cover my ears. You don't understand what you're doing, the distorted voice hissed through the speakers, now sounding desperate. You'll be so alone. Is that what you want? To be completely alone? My phone buzzed again, the hub next. Then the power. Hurry. I unplugged the smart home hub, my hands trembling. The distorted voice began to laugh, a horrible, broken sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. She's trying to scare you, Eleanor's message read. She's weakening. Keep going. I moved to the electrical panel near my front door, throwing open the metal cover. The lights throughout the apartment began to flicker violently. In the hallway, I caught a glimpse of something, a distorted figure, pixelated and jerking, moving toward me with unnatural speed. With one swift motion, I threw the main breaker. Darkness enveloped the apartment. The screeching stopped abruptly, replaced by absolute silence. I fumbled for the lantern, switching it on. Its warm glow created a small circle of light in the darkness. Eleanor? I whispered, looking at my phone. The screen remained dark, the battery drained completely despite being at 80% moments ago. I was alone. Truly alone. For 3 days, I lived in darkness. No internet, no electricity, no connection to the outside world except for the basic flip phone, which I used only to call my boss and claim a family emergency. I ate cold food, read by candlelight, and jumped at every sound. The silence was deafening after years of constant digital noise. On the fourth day, I finally worked up the courage to restore power, just the electricity, nothing else. The lights came back on, the refrigerator hummed to life, but I left every smart device unplugged, the router disconnected, the hub in pieces after I'd taken a hammer to it in a fit of paranoia. 2 weeks later, I moved out of the apartment. I found a small house on the outskirts of the city, older, with minimal wiring that couldn't support the kind of network I had before. I installed a basic internet connection for work, but no smart devices, no voice assistants, no cameras. Sometimes, while I'm lying in bed at night, I think I hear the faintest whisper coming from my old flip phone, "Thank you." I never know if it's Eleanor saying goodbye, or just my imagination, a remnant of those terrifying days. But I've learned my lesson. The digital world offers convenience, but some connections are best left severed. Because sometimes, when you ask your device a question, you never know who or what might answer back. I'll create a ghost story set on a ski trail in Colorado, written in English as requested. I'll structure it in 5 chapters according to your guidelines. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.